That's right, we're all free will burning down through time as we are here again to make our fate. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and all you ETs out there on the bite waves of the internet and wherever you're at down through time monitoring this show. I'm Gary Legier, the Mars Revealer, known also as the Mad Martian, and I would like to welcome you all to the Martian Revelation that is upon you all again now. Welcome to the Bazaar. And today is February 8th of 2020, or the 9th, depending upon your time zone as this airs through time. And you're listening to this broadcast through Global Enlightenment Radio Network stream, and whoever and wherever else is streaming this, as well as through the Martian Revelation Show YouTube stream live at
www.thefacesofmars.com. That's www.thefacesofmars.com.
That's right, which everyone knows is your defense for the war which we all fight against evil dark missioners, who are all leading you away from the light and the truth and manipulating you all instead to help you open your wallets and your pocketbooks, to only join their dark-sided special clubs that only allows them more power to continue to mislead you all and to steer you all away from the truth that they themselves not wish to face or even admit to, let alone even talk about.
Yeah, UFO Diaries.
Faces on Mars.
Cover-up controversy.
Down through time.
Huge conspiracy.
It is a conspiracy.
Okay.
That's right, but the Martian Revelation is, however, 100% listener supported, with no special clubs or special subscriptions to join. So if you're a listener, please help support the Martian Revelation Show, again, which is your only defense for the war which we all fight against those evil dark missioners. And we're working with the goal each week to bring you the truth one show at a time. So please share the facesofmars.com link. And I must also ask you all that you please, though, donate to the show with anything that you could afford. $5, $10, $20, or whatever else that you think is worthy that you could afford for our cause by clicking on the big red, white, and blue American button at the top of the show page to allow it to continue being here for you down through time. That's all right. It goes right to PayPal, as it is because of you, the listener, of which makes the Martian Revelation possible to be brought to you all back through time. So your listenership and your donation support actually counts, and it helps us all to not only fight, but to win against those evil dark missioners, as well as to secure a future which we all could literally make the Martian Revelation our reality. By what, you say? By making our fate. And you know how else you can make our fate? By emailing me at marsrevealer@gmail.com. That's marsrevealer@gmail.com. And using that email address, you can send me messages, questions, music, or artwork, or guest requests, or if you wish to request to be a guest, or anything else that you would like to speak to me about, especially if you would like to advertise on this show and or sponsor it. Because we need your help, and the numbers are growing, but we cannot make our fate without you, the listener. But especially email marsrevealer@gmail.com if you are someone who is privy and knowledgeable and or has access to any old yet new image data showing other faces of Mars. That's right, other faces of Mars that were taken by the Viking Orbiters program back from 1976 to 1982. And you can see references to the images that I seek on a video called UFO Diaries, Cydonia, Discover the Earth-Mars Connection, also seen on the facesofmars.com page. That's right. Controversy and conspiracy.
Huge conspiracy.
It is a conspiracy.
And in that video, you will see the fact that there is a one Richard C. Hoagland who's in more than a third of that video, who is the one on June 1st of 2006 who encouraged me to investigate into these because, quote, he was too swamped at present. Was he admitting he was part of the swamp? You can't make this crap up. But I did the investigation, and I got the producers onto the show who both claim that Richard Hoagland is the one that provided those images. But there's a long, twisty road to that story in this, to which now, down through time, can make things safe to be seen and acknowledged. So check out those images and ask him about them, as well as if you also have any, even from modern space image data that you may have access or privy to that you think that we the people have a right to see. I will be your public sector. You can stay our private sector need be. In order to bring out this information, anonymity will be respected and upheld. And there's lots of other things to do there on the facesofmars.com page. If you go there, you can scroll on down. You can see the information about tonight's special guest, Mr. Paul Anthony Wallace. You can click on his links there as well as his book. And also don't forget, you can see on that page, be sure you check it out. Dr. Moore Colado has his latest Before Atlantis article, Before Zep Tepi, which means the first time. You may want to check that out. And that's continuing informational data from his book that you could also click on the page and buy that book called Before Atlantis, New Evidence Suggesting the Existence of a Previous Technological Civilization on Earth, again by Dr. Moore Carlotto. And under that, you can see something that I recently put forth, which I was sitting up for months from one of my image processings from the raw data of the face of Cydonia, of the many swaths that they have available, which has some interesting features on it. No one has mentioned anything about it, though I've had it, pun intended, all in front of everyone's faces for months, and not one has noticed it. So I finally made a 28-second little video to show that there are features on the face of Cydonia on the feline side, for those familiar with the face. If not, get familiar. But these certain features on the feline side of the face show an alignment like the Giza pyramids do of the constellation of Orion. And I overlay in a fast way. I could have done it a little better, but you all get the point, pun intended. I overlay an above view of the Giza pyramids on top of these features to help point out these features, that it's in the same alignment as the Giza pyramids. This cannot be a coincidence. But scroll on down more, you can see some images there that I found on Mars, including another face. But definitely check out Rami Bar-Ilan's new cool Mars finds. And you can click on those images to go to exclusive Mars imagery on Facebook. And he's done a lot of awesome work, as well as many others who share and participate in their hunt for the strange things being found on the roving ground imagery from Curiosity rover, showing some very interesting non-natural looking things. And you got the original raw image data links for those particular images there as well as scroll down the page again, UFO Diaries Cydonia, and you could, under that, you can see the various screen grabs which I compiled as scenes that shows you the mysterious UFOs, unidentified flying objects or unidentified facial objects that zoom by real fast in the video. That's pretty much, if you don't know what you're looking for, if you just don't see it, you won't see it. So I help you out there. I do the homework and put it together for you, that there's very many questions arisen that need to be asked of Richard C. Hoagland in regards to those images. And under that, you can see the preliminary report for the UFO Diaries Faces of Mars from 2007 by Dr. John Brandenburg. That's right. And under that, you can see Richard Hoagland's unofficial disclosure of where we're at now down through time, where we got him unofficially explaining what he could not officially bring forth and talk about at that time. But I do believe that, just like by Brookings, in the Brookings model, that we are coming to a time now where we must be told, and this is safe to be seen, and where he then could officially come out and acknowledge it himself, and it could change and literally rewrite history. And his legacy will go down as it should be and as would be deserved at that point. And there's other things to see and do on that page. So again, thefacesofmars.com. So just remember also that if you're listening to this Martian Revelation show, then know this, that you are the resistance down through time. So that being said, again, we got an interesting show tonight with a special guest, Mr. Paul Anthony Wallace, as we're going to be discussing some interesting aspects of escaping from Eden. So we're all looking forward to that and to your questions. But before all that, let's get into some news. Now, our first news article comes from Mike Wall, Space.com, 3 days ago. Trump touts Space Force, Moon and Mars plans and State of the Union address. Space exploration got a couple of shout-outs in President Donald Trump's State of the Union address Tuesday night of February 4th. During the nearly 80-minute speech, Trump touted the recent establishment of the Space Force, the first new U.S. military branch to be stood up since the Air Force in 1947. A crucial year in American history, as well as in our technological prowess, shall we say, as one of his administration's key accomplishments thus far. And one of the president's special guests for the State of the Union, which is held every year in the House of Representatives chamber of the U.S. Capitol building, was a kid with Space Force dreams, who happens to be the great-grandson of the last surviving Tuskegee Airman. President Trump stated that in the gallery tonight we have a young gentleman, and what he wants so badly at 13 years old, Lane Lanphier, he is an 8th grader from Arizona. And Lane, please stand up. Lane has always dreamed of going to space. He was the first in his class and among the youngest at an aviation academy. He aspires to go to the Air Force Academy, and then he has his eye on the Space Force. As Lane says, most people look up at space. I want to look down on the world. President Trump also referenced NASA's Artemis program of crewed lunar exploration. Artemis aims to put astronauts on the surface of the moon by 2024 and use Earth's nearest neighbor as a training ground for crewed missions to Mars in the 2030s. Even though I say, and even he says at other times, that Mars is the main goal and that we should do, and in my opinion, that we should do both simultaneously. We don't need the moon first in order to go to Mars. Just saying. But anyway, NASA originally targeted 2028 for the human lunar landing, which will be the first since the Apollo 17 mission in 1972. But Vice President Mike Pence announced an accelerated timeline in March of last year. Last month, the House Science Committee introduced an appropriations bill that would retarget 2028 for the lunar landing. But that bill has a long way to go before being enacted as law. In reaffirming our heritage as a free nation, we must remember that America has always been a frontier nation. Now we must embrace the next frontier, America's manifest destiny in the stars, Trump said during the February 4th speech. I'm asking Congress to fully fund the Artemis program to ensure that the next man and first woman on the moon will be American astronauts, using this as a launching pad to ensure that America is the first nation to plant its flag on Mars, to which most of the whole room clapped and shouted with glee. And we'll soon see that kind of funding he has in mind. The White House is expected to unveil its 2021 federal budget request on Monday of February 10th. President Trump has made a fair bit of space news during his first 3 years in office. There's the Space Force, of course, and the Space Policy Directive 1, which officially set the nation's human spaceflight program on its moon to Mars path. President Barack Obama has directed NASA to get people to Mars, but to use an asteroid as a stepping stone. He did a lot more than that. He was really destroying our public space program and aspirations, the traitor that he is. But Trump has also signed 2 other space policy directives, which deal with space traffic management and the regulation of commercial activities in space, respectively. And in 2017, President Trump resurrected the National Space Council, which helps steer American space policy, which Vice President Mike Pence sits as its chairman. And to such National Space Council that has last been active in the early 1990s during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, especially during his speech of Moon, Mars, and Beyond. So that was a nice historical fact and tidbit being thrown into people's face that this is serious and this is a goal that needs to be met. So all the more power to us and we the people as we make our fate unto the Martian revelation that beckons us. So that being said, let's move on to the next article by Glenn Collinson for GSSC News in Greenbelt, Maryland. Also from February 4th, MAVEN explores Mars to understand radio interference at Earth. NASA's MAVEN, Mars Atmosphere and Volatile Evolution spacecraft, has discovered layers and rifts in the electrically charged part of the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere of Mars. The phenomenon is very common at Earth and causes unpredictable disruptions to radio communications. However, we do not fully understand them because they form at altitudes that are very difficult to explore at Earth. The unexpected discovery by Maven shows that Mars is a unique laboratory to explore and better understand this highly disruptive phenomena. The layers are so close above all our heads at Earth and can be detected by anyone with a radio, but they are still quite mysterious, says Glenn Collinson of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, lead author of a paper on this research appearing February 3rd in Nature Astronomy. Who would have thought one of the best ways to understand them is to launch a satellite 300 million miles to Mars? If your favorite radio station has ever jammed or been replaced by another station, a likely cause are layers of electrically charged gas called plasma in the very uppermost region of the atmosphere called the ionosphere. Forming suddenly and lasting for several hours, these layers act like giant mirrors in the sky, causing radio signals from far away to bounce over the horizon where they can interfere with local transmissions, like two people trying to talk over one another. The layers can also cause interference with radio communications by aircraft and shipping, and can blind military radar. At Earth, the layers form at an altitude of about 60 miles, where the air is too thin for an aircraft to fly, but too thick for any satellite to orbit. The only way to reach them is with a rocket, but these missions last only tens of minutes before falling back to Earth. We've known they exist for over 80 years, but we know so little about what goes on inside them because no satellite could get low enough to reach the layers, says Collinson, at least no satellite at Earth. But at Mars, spacecraft such as Maven can orbit at lower altitudes and can sample these features directly. Maven carries several scientific instruments that measure plasmas in the atmosphere and space around Mars. Recent measurements from one of these instruments detected unexpected sudden spikes in the abundance of plasma as it flew through the Martian ionosphere. Joe Grabowski, former Maven project scientist at NASA Goddard, immediately recognized the spike from his previous experience with rocket flights through the layers at Earth. Not only had Maven discovered that such layers can occur at other planets than Earth, but the new results reveal that Mars offers what Earth cannot, a place where we can reliably explore these layers with satellites. The low altitudes observable by Maven will fill in a great gap in our understanding of this region on both Mars and Earth, with really significant discoveries to be had, says Grabowski, a co-author on the paper. Maven observations are already overturning many of our existing ideas about the phenomena. Maven had discovered that the layers also have a mirror opposite, a rift, where plasma is less abundant. The existence of such rifts in nature was completely unknown before the discovery at Mars by Maven, and overturns existing scientific models which say they cannot form. Additionally, unlike at Earth, where the layers are short-lived and unpredictable, the Martian layers are surprisingly long-lived and persistent. That's pretty interesting. But these new discoveries already have given us a better understanding of the fundamental processes that underpin these layers, and future exploration at Mars will allow us to build better scientific models of how they form. While much like the weather, we cannot stop them from forming, perhaps someday the new insights from Mars may help us to forecast them at Earth, meaning more reliable radio communication for us all. This research was funded by the Maven mission. Maven's principal investigator is based at the University of Colorado's Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, and NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, manages the Maven project. Partner institutions include Lockheed Martin, the University of California at Berkeley, and NASA's JPL Laboratory. NASA is exploring our solar system and beyond, uncovering worlds, stars, and cosmic mysteries near and far with our powerful fleet of space and ground-based missions. So while they give themselves pats on the back, notice that, again, history and scientific facts are being rewritten and models destroyed by new information. Now, this one kind of segues in a way by the staff writers from ESA in Paris from February 6th. The first time controlling two spacecraft with one dish. For the first time, an ESA deep space antenna has sent commands to two ESA spacecraft simultaneously at the Red Planet. Late on Thursday of January 30th, the 35-meter new Norcia dish in Western Australia spoke to Mars Express and the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter. Talking with two voices at two different frequencies ensured the signals sent didn't interfere with each other. The successful test is an important step in increasing the flexibility of ESA's S-Track network of antennas across the globe to find, control, or receive data from missions across space. The vast majority of conversations between Earth and space involve one antenna on the ground, one spacecraft in orbit, or out in the solar system, and signals at a particular frequency going between the two. In cases where several spacecraft are located in one part of the sky, all in orbit around Mars, for example, it's possible for an antenna to see all of these spacecraft at once. As ESA ground stations have 4 receivers, they can, in principle, receive data from up to 4 spacecraft simultaneously. This technique, called multiple spacecraft per aperture, or MSPA, is used routinely by ESA's S-Track and NASA's Deep Space Networks. However, MSPA only works one way. While it allows the ground station to receive data from multiple spacecraft, it can only speak to one at a time. That is, at least until now. Ground stations are built with 2 transmitters, pieces of equipment used to generate and transmit electromagnetic waves, which is light carrying messages or signals. Normally, stations send signals using only one transmitter at a time, and the other is there as a backup in case the first breaks down. The recent test with the new North Shore ground station, the first of its kind, saw the deep dish use both transmitters at the same time to control Mars Express and ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter. Normally, the 2 Martian orbiters receive their command signals in very similar frequencies, known as the X-band, between 8 to 12 gigahertz, but from different stations or using one station at different times. However, Mars Express can also receive signals in the S-band at a frequency of approximately 2.8 gigahertz, which until now has been saved for emergencies. The perfect alignment of events, 2 spacecraft close in the sky, able to receive telemetry signals at different wavelengths, and a deep space station able to send both telecommand signals simultaneously, made it possible to combine multiple spacecraft per aperture with multiple uplink per aperture in an ESA first. Historically, there hasn't been a need to use one dish to command multiple simultaneous missions, as there wasn't such a demand on the antennas. However, ESA's global network of antennas, S-Track, is running at peak capacity, meaning that the antennas can't fully serve the needs of all missions until the network capacity is increased. Deep space missions have the added problem that they require large antennas, of which there are only 3 for now in the network, located in Australia, Argentina, and Malarkey. I'm sure I'm saying that name wrong. Hopefully it ain't full of it. But for many years, Mars Express was only one of 3 spacecraft orbiting Mars. Now the Red Planet has 7 such orbiters operated by various space agencies, with more on the way. ESA's control center has a team dedicated to ensuring all missions get sufficient ground station time. By working out new ways of sharing ground stations, we allow more users to access current resources while new antennas are being built. Find out more about S-Track and check out in real time which spacecraft each ground station in the network is talking to with S-Track now. So that's interesting. Technology's getting better. And again, the race is on. So let's go on to the next article. This one's from January 28th of 2020. Mystery at Mars's Pole explained. In 1966, 2 Caltech scientists were ruminating on the implications of the thin carbon dioxide Martian atmosphere first revealed by Mariner 4, a NASA flyby spacecraft built and flown by JPL. They theorized that Mars with such an atmosphere could have a long-term stable polar deposit of CO2 ice that in turn would control global atmospheric pressure. A new study from Caltech suggests that the theory developed by physicist Robert B. Layton and planetary scientist Bruce C. Murray may indeed be correct. Carbon dioxide makes up more than 95% of Mars's atmosphere, which has a surface pressure of only 0.6% that of Earth. One prediction of Layton's and Murray's theory, with enormous implications for climate change on Mars, is that its atmospheric pressure would swing in value as the planet wobbles on its axis during its orbit around the sun, exposing the poles to more or less sunlight. Direct sunlight on the CO2 ice deposited at the poles leads to sublimation, the direct transition of a material from a solid to a gaseous state. Layton and Murray predicted that as exposure to sunlight shifts, atmospheric pressure could swing from just 1/4 that of today's Martian atmosphere to twice that of today over cycles of tens of thousands of years. Now a new model by Peter Buehler of JPL, which Caltech manages for NASA, and colleagues from Caltech, JPL, and the University of Colorado, provides key evidence to support this. The model was described in a paper published in the journal Nature Astronomy on December 23rd. The team explored the existence of a mysterious feature at the South Pole of Mars, a massive deposit of CO2 ice and water in an alternating strata, like the layers of a cake, that extend to a depth of about 1 kilometer with a thin frosting of CO2 ice at the top. The layer cake deposit contains as much CO2 as in the entire Martian atmosphere today. In theory, that layering should not be possible because water ice is more thermally stable and darker than CO2 ice. CO2 ice, scientists long believed, would quickly destabilize if it was buried underneath water ice. However, the new model by Buehler and colleagues shows that the deposit could have evolved as a result of a combination of 3 factors. 1, the changing obliquity or tilt of the planet's rotation. 2, the difference in the way water ice and CO2 ice reflect sunlight. And 3, the increase in atmospheric pressure that occurs when CO2 ice sublimes. Usually, when you run a model, you don't expect the results to match so closely to what you observe. But the thickness of the layers as determined by the model matches beautifully with radar measurements from orbiting satellites, says Buehler. Here's how the deposit formed, the researchers suggest. As Mars wobbled on its rotational axis over the past 510,000 years, the South Pole received varying amounts of sunlight, allowing CO2 ice to form when the poles were receiving less sunlight and causing it to sublime when the poles were sunnier. When CO2 ice formed, small amounts of water ice were trapped along with the CO2 ice, and when the CO2 sublimed, the more stable water ice was left behind and consolidated into layers. But the water layers do not totally seal the deposit. Instead, the subliming CO2 raises Mars's atmospheric pressure, and the layer cake with CO2 ice evolves in equilibrium with the atmosphere. When the sunlight starts declining again, a new CO2 ice layer forms on top of the water layer, and the cycle repeats. Because sublimation episodes have generally been declining in intensity, some CO2 ice was left behind between the water layers, thus the alternation of CO2 and water ice. The deepest and therefore oldest CO2 layer formed 510,000 years ago, following the last period of extreme polar sunlight when all the CO2 sublimed into the atmosphere. Oh, that's interesting theory. But our determination of the history of Mars's large pressure swings is fundamental to understanding the evolution of Mars's climate, including the history of liquid water stability and habitability over Mars's surface, Buehler says. This work was part of Buehler's thesis work at Caltech. He continued the research in his current role as a postdoctoral researcher at JPL. His co-authors are his former advisors, Andy Ingersoll and Bethany Ellman, both professors of planetary science at Caltech, Sylvain Picot of JPL, and Paul Hain of the University of Colorado Boulder. The study is titled Coevolution of Mars's Atmosphere and Massive South Polar CO2 Ice Deposit. This research was funded by NASA. Well, it is interesting. That's why I wanted to read it, because the poles look very odd in their shaping and in how they're styled and how they're looking, especially in regards where it comes to ice or water ice or frozen CO2. It leaves behind a beautiful artscape, as it was, of layers and features that one can only imagine what also must be trapped within those layers and features down through time. But anyway, let's move on to our next article. And this one again is by Mike Wall from the 7th, space.com. Voyager 2 bounces back from glitch in interstellar space. The venerable NASA spacecraft is gathering science data once again. Voyager 2 is taking the measure of its exotic surroundings once again. On January 25th, the venerable probe, which has been exploring interstellar space since November of 2018, failed to execute a spin maneuver as intended. As a result, 2 onboard systems remained on longer than planned, sucking up so much energy that Voyager 2 automatically shut off its science instruments. One could also imagine behind the scenes, what did it really see or find that made it shut off the instruments? But, that's called conspiratorial bent that listeners to this show could appreciate, because they know and appreciate that behind the scenes, there's always much more going on than what they're telling us on the surface. But mission team members expressed confidence at the time that they could troubleshoot the problem, and their confidence has been borne out. Voyager 2 science gear is back up and running, NASA announced Wednesday, February 5th. Mission operators report that Voyager 2 continues to be stable and that communications between Earth and the spacecraft are good, agency officials wrote in a mission update yesterday. The spacecraft has resumed taking science data, and the science teams are now evaluating the health of the instruments following their brief shutoff. Voyager 2 and its twin Voyager 1 launched a few weeks apart in 1977 to perform an unprecedented grand tour of the outer solar system. And many listeners of this show may know and appreciate that many believe that they were looking for the perturber, the mysterious Planet X. But both spacecraft conducted flybys of Jupiter and Saturn, revealing a great deal about the solar system's 2 biggest planets. Voyager 2 then zoomed past Uranus in 1986 and Neptune in 1989. The probe remains the only craft that have gotten up-close looks at either of these ice giants. And both Voyagers just kept on flying, entering extended interstellar missions. Voyager 1 popped free into interstellar space in August of 2012, and its twin followed suit 6 years later. The 2 spacecraft are still going strong after more than 42 years in space, but they can't keep up their pioneering work forever. The radioisotope thermoelectric generators that power the Voyagers are running low on juice and will likely be tapped out by the mid-2020s, NASA officials have said. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 are currently about 13.8 billion miles and 11.5 billion miles from Earth, respectively. It takes more than 17 hours for light to travel from Earth to Voyager 2, meaning that mission team members have to wait a day and a half to see if their commands work. It just gives you a brief idea of the complexity of distance and that messages take to travel across time and space. So that's an interesting tidbit of news. But here's another tidbit of news regarding signals coming from deep space. And this one's from yesterday, February 7th, by Becky Ferreira. Something in deep space is sending signals to Earth in steady 16-day cycles. Scientists have discovered the first fast radio burst that beats at a steady rhythm, and the mysterious repeating signal is coming from the outskirts of another galaxy. A mysterious radio source located in a galaxy 500 million light years from Earth is pulsing on a 16-day cycle like clockwork, according to a new study. This marks the first time that scientists have ever detected periodicity in these signals, which are known as fast radio bursts, FRBs, and is a major step toward unmasking their sources. FRBs are one of the most tantalizing puzzles that the universe has thrown at scientists in recent years. First spotted in 2007, these powerful radio bursts are produced by energetic sources, though nobody is sure what those might be. FRBs are also mystifying because they could either be one-offs or repeaters, meaning some bursts appear only once in a certain part of the sky, while others emit multiple flashes to Earth. Pulses from these repeat bursts have so far seemed somewhat random and discordant in their timing. But that changed last year when the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment Fast Radio Burst Project, a group dedicated to observing and studying FRBs, discovered that a repeater called FRB 18916.J0158 plus 65 had a regular cadence. The Chime FRB team kept tabs on the repeating bursts between September 2018 and October 2019 using the Chime radio telescope in British Columbia. During that period, the bursts were clustered into a period of 4 days and then seemed to switch off for the next 12 days for a total cycle of about 16 days. Some cycles did not produce any visible bursts, but those that did were all synced up to the same 16-day intervals. You see, there's reciprocity in them, which to me, and especially I'm sure to SETI scientists and radio astronomers, that they look for patterns that are consistent to show of intelligent design. But anyway, we conclude that this is the first detected periodicity of any kind of an FRB source, the team said in a paper published on the preprint server Archive in late January. The discovery of a 16.35-day periodicity in a repeating FRB source is an important clue to the nature of this object. Well, I would say, to me, it indicates that someone or something is sending messages across deep space. But scientists recently tracked down this particular FRB to a galaxy called SDSS J015800.28 plus 654.253.0, which is a 500 million light years from Earth. So a 500 million light years from Earth, meaning that what we're seeing now of it was sent 500 million years ago. That may seem like a huge distance, but FRB 18916.J0158 plus 65 is actually the closest FRB ever detected. But while we know where it is, we still don't know what it is. To that point, the beat of the FRB suggests that it might be modulated by its surroundings. If the source of the FRB is orbiting a compact object, such as a black hole, then it might only flash its signals toward Earth at a certain point in its orbital period. That scenario could potentially match this recognizable 16-day cycle. Sure. Stick to something natural that you still can't even really explain about what black holes are, to anything that doesn't have to do with intelligent design. They always want to steer from that, but behind the scenes, they're really biting their nails in anticipation at some type of intelligence behind it. Don't buy the bullshit. But it's also possible that we are witnessing a binary system containing a massive star and a super-dense stellar core known as a neutron star, according to a study published on Archive on Wednesday by a separate team that looked at the same data. In that model, the neutron star would emit radio bursts, but those signals would be periodically eclipsed by opaque outflowing winds from its giant companion. Again, they don't even see it. They got a general idea where it is, but now they're just guessing again to state anything of natural means to steer clear from the assumption and the proposition to you all that it's of intelligent origin. But another scenario is that the FRB rhythm isn't tempered by another object and is sending out the pulses directly from the source. Scientists have previously suggested that flares from highly magnetized neutron stars called magnetars may be the source of some FRBs. But since magnetars tend to rotate every few seconds, a 16-day cycle does not match the expected profile of a magnetar-based FRB. So in other words, people, read between the lines, cut through the bullshit, and start considering intelligent design. But ultimately, the Chime FRB team hopes to find similar patterns in a handful of known repeated bursts to see if these cycles are common. The researchers also plan to keep a careful eye on FRB 18916.J0158 plus 6 while it is active in order to spot any other details that may point to its identity. FRBs have baffled scientists for more than a decade, but new facilities such as Chime are revealing new details about these weird events every year, which we still don't know what is blasting out these bizarre signals, again, in timely manners like that. Consistency, right? The discovery of a clear tempo from one of these sources provides a significant lead for scientists to follow. Yes, it does, but only if they start considering the consideration that it's designed and being sent by an intelligent design, an intelligent purpose. And that's the big picture here, because that would indicate life way out there. And like Dr. Gil Levin says, and others believe, that life is universal. And that's pretty much a theme for tonight's show, with segues into our guest a little bit soon with Paul Anthony Wallace. Because not only can signals and their signatures be seen by transmission coming through light, but also can be seen and detected in the microscopic world, embedded in life itself, in the very fabric of life itself, which is in DNA, into which we, and all life as we know it, has, and which makes it, in which forms all these various particular forms of life as we know it, and other forms of which we not know it, or of which we have forgotten. Signatures and transmissions stored in the DNA, to which life from billions of light years away, like that FRB transmission, could have come from and laid their history, their signature of themselves even, inside the genetics of the worlds and places to which they have traveled or have been to and wish to imprint upon worlds. And to consider such, let's play something by Paul Anthony Wallace here, of something very important to consider when considering our own ancient past. So let's listen to this.
Vladimir Sherbak and Maxim Akulov from the Al-Farabi Kazakh National University and the Fezenkov Astrophysical Institute have devoted 13 years to the Human Genome Project, mapping human DNA coding. Together, they have concluded that human beings were intelligently designed with what they describe as arithmetic patterns and symbolic language encoded into our DNA. Makulov and Sherbak have identified 9 multiples of 37 scattered through our genetic code. Speaking to New Scientist, Makulov described the pattern as very hard to ascribe to natural processes. In 1985, Carl Sagan wrote his only novel, and it became the movie Contact in 1997. The story revolves around a signal broadcast to planet Earth from a distant and advanced civilization. And the clue in the signal, that it is a non-random signal, that it's come from an intelligent source, is a repetition of prime numbers in the frequency of the signal. That is something that couldn't occur naturally. This is from an intelligent source. Where did Carl Sagan get that wonderful idea of the repetition of primes being a signature? It's a strange coincidence, because Vladimir Sherbak and Maxim Akulov, who are 2 top authorities in the field of human DNA research, have identified exactly that signature in the DNA coding for human beings. In our genetic code, there occur 9 repetitions of multiples of 37 in our DNA. And the researchers point out that the likelihood of that happening by chance are 1 in 10 trillion. In a mastery of understatement, Makulov explained, "It was clear right away that the code has a non-random structure. Sooner or later, we have to accept the fact that all life on Earth carries the genetic code of our extraterrestrial cousins, and that evolution is not what we think it is." The Russian physicist Yuri Rumer first identified one set of repetitions back in 1966. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA, and senior physicist Leslie Orgel added their voice to support the theory that the origins of human DNA are extraterrestrial. In the 21st century, Maxim Makulov and Vladimir Sherbak have added the weight of solid data and empirical support. This is information we've only had in the last decade. So how did Carl Sagan know this in 1985? It wouldn't be the first time that privileged information had been passed on to a movie maker or a scriptwriter. But on the other hand, I happen to know that Carl Sagan was a student of the world's ancient mythologies, and in particular the Babylonian and Sumerian. Did he find something buried there that gave him this clue of what we were to find? Mikulov and Scherbak argue that those who intervened in human evolution very deliberately left their signature behind in our DNA coding for us to find. In fact, modern film lore is littered with narratives that suggest an ET intervention in the evolution of Homo sapiens. And one very interesting clue comes in the 20th century novels and movie franchise of Planet of the Apes, because in that story, a higher species, in that case the humans, genetically modify the apes to become more useful as slaves, in effect. The apes can do the hard yakka, the heavy lifting kind of work, if we can just modify them to be a little bit more intelligent. And of course, all kinds of trouble ensues from that decision. But that idea is not an original one. It can be found in the Sumerian narrative of beginnings. In their stories of beginnings, humanity is engineered by sky people who come to planet Earth, modify the beings that are here to do the hard yakka and heavy lifting for them. In the Mayan tradition of the Popol Vuh, is very frank about the engineering of humanity. That narrative describes the arrival on planet Earth of those who engineer, and it's the story of Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl. And those entities have a conversation among themselves that goes like this: let us make avatars for ourselves to do the work and bring us our food. It's the same story that emerges in the Planet of the Apes. Did Pierre Boulle create this story out of a knowledge of ancient mythologies? Or is this another example of storytelling accessing information from a wider field of consciousness? Do these narratives keep emerging because in our storytelling, we're actually remembering something from our prehistoric past? In 1967, there was an episode of the first season of Star Trek called The Return of the Archons. It was written by Boris Sobelman and Gene Roddenberry. And in the storyline, there is a planet populated by human beings who are kept in order by a priesthood that acts as intermediaries between them and a kind of deity figure. And as Captain Kirk and the crew explore what's going on, they realize that the priesthood is really acting on behalf of a computer program. There is no God there. It's just them, the computer program, and the subjected, pacified human population. And it's a rather strange echo of what we see in the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. Because through the history of the Old Testament, we can find moments where we're looking at a society of human colonies, each ruled over by another kind of entity called Elohim or a Bene Elohim. And they're not human, they are a higher species. And it's as if humanity's been carved up for management by the colonizers. But it's not an easy relationship between these higher powers, and the Bene Elohim often send the humans out to war against each other because the Elohim are in competition with one another for resources. As we get further into the story of the Old Testament, it becomes unclear whether the powerful ones, the Elohim, are still there, or if the prophets are still in place and the priesthoods are still in place and the totems are there for consultation. but there are no other gods present in the picture, even though the structure of priesthoods and prophets is still present. How did Boris Sobelman and Gene Roddenberry chance upon that storyline? Again, it could be because they were scholars of the ancient mythologies, which I believe they were. But often in our storytelling, we start telling the truth without fully realizing that's what we're doing. Now, you might say, well, that's a very interesting idea, Paul, but is there any way of testing that? We had the opportunity in 2003 to test one of the oldest stories, if not the oldest story, of human civilization, and it's the Epic of Gilgamesh.
And that's a very interesting story regarding the Epic of Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh was a hybrid between human and one of these B'nai Elohim / Anunnaki so-called gods from the sky. He was faced with a dilemma of himself, knowing about who he is and his origins, and he didn't like the fact that he would have to suffer the fate of what normal people would be, which was their creation of humanity. Since he was half part of them, he wanted to have their long life that they had. He wanted to have what they had. And he had to come face to face, no pun intended, with the reality that his fate was sealed, and not to be of and part of them, but to live out his life here on earth as if he were human. So he had to deal with that. And there's a lot more to that epic, but it only goes to show that of which and what we are is not of our own doing and our own making. We have a creator. We didn't evolve from monkeys falling out of a tree.
Oh, you saw it with me. All right. All of you just dumb me up, huh? Because here it is. Quote. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman and brought her unto the man. Cut that out, huh? That ain't all he brought her unto the man for. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Now, there it is, in black and white. We didn't crawl out from under no rocks. We didn't have no tails. We didn't come from monkeys, you atheistic pinko meat.
We were modified genetically with their essence and their signatures of who they are from the stars. So it's very fascinating stuff, and we're going to get into that. So I think it's time that we should go to a break, and listeners to this show could appreciate we have a motto here. Pack them and smoke them, because you're definitely going to need them when we come back and introduce our guest, Mr. Paul Anthony Wallace, as we get into Escaping from Eden on the Martian Revelation.
I'll be back.
Don't run. We are your friends.
Imagine that everything the U.S. government has told you about UFOs since Roswell has been a lie. Imagine that in a decade after Roswell, the government attempted communication with the aliens and succeeded. And after that, in absolute secrecy, things had gone far, far beyond this. Now imagine that tomorrow, the whole secret program is going to fall apart, and every terrible thing is going to come out. All we have left now is a prayer. Morning Star Pass. The collapse of the UFO cover-up. A fictional but unflinching and terrifying look inside the UFO cover-up. The secret government that supports it and the world of the aliens themselves. And then, how the whole secret kingdom ends. Morningstar Pass. A book that pulls no punches and does not sheath the sword unblooded. Morningstar Pass. Plunging boldly where no other book has ventured. Captures the whole wondrous nightmare that the UFO experience has become. From bizarre experiments performed on helpless abductees, to horrifying mutilations, to beyond, to the world of secret government supported by its own secret police, to the aliens in their secret bases, and finally to the beckoning stars themselves. The book does this by placing the cover-up, humanity, and the Earth in a real cosmos, where humanity and its passions are a part of the universe, not an aberration on it. Then comes the fall of the cover-up. In a climax of violence and desperation, to leave the human race facing the multi-hued stars with eyes open and seeking its place in them. The sands of time have run out for the cover-up, for against it, leading an army of investigators and warriors, comes Cassandra Chen, beautiful, driven, and doomed. Who can save her and us? Haha, you'll have to read it to find out. Morningstar Pass, The Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up by Victor Norgard. Get yours today. You can find this at www.firstbooks.com.
Dark night, planets are set. Creator prepares for the dawn of man. You're waking up. The day of incarnation. Said you're waking up to life. The day of incarnation. Said you're waking up to life.
that you're all bag and pack them and smoke them, let's introduce our special guest, Mr. Paul Anthony Wallace. And Paul Anthony Wallace is a popular speaker, researcher, and author of books on spirituality and mysticism. His work probes the world's mythologies for their insight into human origins and human potential. Paul is a healing practitioner and has worked as a theological educator, training pastors in the interpretation of text, and as an archdeacon for the Anglican Episcopal Church in Australia. Paul's books include My Dinner with Anton, 2010 and 2000, The New Monastic, 2009, Be Thou My Breastplate, 2009, and Men Behaving Boldly, 1998. He is a regular contributor to the Paranormal Chronicles magazine and the Fifth Kind TV in collaboration with Gaia TV. He grew up in England, studied in the UK, Italy, and Brazil, had a home for 10 years in Canada, and now lives with his young family in Canberra, Australia. His travels have included horse trekking in the depths of the Grand Canyon and the heights of the Himalayas, swimming in the Amazon, parachuting in Australia, and surviving a charging rhinoceros even in Zambia. Along with more peaceful pilgrimages to Egypt, Zimbabwe, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Singapore, New Zealand, and Kashmir. And Paul's studies in languages, linguistics, and theology took him to the University of Bath, England, the Machiavelli Institute in Florence, Italy, St. John's College, and the University of Nottingham in the UK, and the Brazil's Institute Pastoral Regional in Belém, Amazonia. Paul's books draw on diverse sources to explore the realm of spirituality and mysticism, probing the world mythology and ancestral narratives for their insights into human origins and the releasing of our potential for a more conscious, more awake, and better human experience. When an ultimate Frisbee injury laid Paul up and set him on the path of probing the ancient sources of the book of Genesis, he did not expect it to lead him onto the ET territory. He was later to learn that the connection is between his earlier titles on mythical and shamanic traditions and the implications of escaping from Eden. The familiar canon of stories in the book of Genesis affirm that God made the universe, planet Earth, Adam and Eve, and you and me. However, the presence in those stories of the holy name of God, not revealed until the time of Moses, clues us that we're not reading the original version of these stories. Far from it. So what was wrong with these original versions that they had to be changed? Just what was the original stories and what did they say about who we are and where we all came from? What was the earliest story of human origins, almost obliterated from the human canon in the 6th century BC and suppressed from Christian writing in the 2nd century AD? And why was that suppression finally lifted in 2009? And what does any of this have to do with ETs? Escaping from Eden probes the biblical text and wrestles with these questions, arriving at some deeply controversial conclusions. The book lifts the lid on a nearly 2,000-year-old taboo and points to truths about ourselves, the universe, and everything that you may have long suspected but not dared to speak. And I got to tell you, it's a real great honor to have you on, Paul. And I really look forward to this show, and I know my listeners do as well. And this is a first-time guest appearance for you with the hopefully chance of many more to come as we make our fate in the Martian Revelation. How you doing today, sir?
Hi, Gary. I'm great, thanks. And it's great to be on the show with you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much. And everyone out there, paulanthonywallace.com. Go to his website there and on the facesofmars.com. Make sure you click also on his YouTube link there. And of course, click on the link to his book there. What's the name of it again? That's right, Escaping from Eden. And that, that's an interesting title, Paul. Escaping from Eden. I can only imagine what that must be about, because that puts a different sound compared to what the story that we're told is. Because from what we know, at least from what I know and what I've read and studied somewhat of, we didn't escape. We were thrown out. Well, is there a relevance there to that name, sir?
Yes, I wanted a title that would intrigue people and tell them straight away there's a story here
that's familiar to you, but lying underneath it is a less familiar story. Obviously, when we think of Eden, we tend to think of a paradise and what a shame we had to leave, so on and so forth. But I found when I started drilling down into some of the anomalies in those familiar stories and familiar texts, that there is a layer of story underneath them, the stories on which they were based, which tell a very different account of human origins. And in that earlier version, the version on which Genesis is based, Eden was not a paradise that we would want to return from. We would have every reason to want to escape from it. But it was a long journey for me to begin to unravel some of these matters. But in the first instance, the thing that got my attention was all the anomalies in the familiar stories of Eden and Adam and Eve and the flood, all the stories of beginnings that are there in the Bible. The moment you sit down and with a child, for instance, and read a children's Bible, any child will start asking some rather obvious questions. You won't have to get any further than Genesis 1 before a young child will say, why does it say, let us make humans to look like one of us? And then a child is going to say, why was it an afterthought to create the female of the species? Couldn't he tell that Adam would need a female? And then we get into Genesis 3 and the snake appears. Well, who's that? Where did he come from? How come he can speak? And couldn't God anticipate that this would happen and this would happen? And why is he imposing a death penalty for eating a piece of fruit? And then you get to Genesis 6. And how's a good and loving God now genociding the entire human race? And then there's something appalling that's done to the human race in Genesis 11. And any child reading those stories with you is going to ask those questions. And most people will say, try and come up with an answer and say to themselves, oh my goodness, I've got to look into that because that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? But most of us are just too busy with other things, living life. Even those of us in the world of ministry get so caught up with things that we don't go back to these things that aren't quite lining up, that are anomalous. We don't go back and say, let me drill into that and find out what's really going on. And so for me, that happened in the book. I talk about an ultimate Frisbee injury laying me off for a while. And that's really a code for all the times when the universe has allowed me time to do some study and to follow up on things of interest. And just a few years ago, I was able to sit down and go back to some of those questions, realizing that an anomaly is really a friend, whether you're in the realm of science or theology or whatever it might be. If you come across an anomaly, that is a clue that your big picture is slightly off, that you've missed something. It's inviting you to look again, and it's going to reveal a different story, a different explanation. And that's exactly what I found.
Well, indeed. So therefore, the child's questions, let's go back to that for a second, because again, that's about the basics of the fundamentals of the faith in which the Christian church is built upon. Can we touch base on some of those questions like you brought up? What are some of the answers that you have found regard to those basics, some of those basics? And would that cancel out where the scriptures ultimately lead us up until kingdom come of King Holy Be Jesus? I mean, certainly all that applies somehow. Was he one of these Benai Elohim Anunnakis? You see where I'm going?
Yeah, absolutely. When these questions come up, obviously the thing that goes through your mind straight away is, are these really stories about God? Is God really like that? Would God do that? And the thing that opens it all up and begins to make sense of these storylines are the words you mentioned, in fact. You see, there are two words that are generally translated as God through the Bible. And one is the holy name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah, and the other is Elohim. Now, the name Yahweh is the name that was revealed to Moses centuries, maybe millennia, after all the events of the stories of the beginnings in Genesis 1 to 11. So when we read those ancient stories and see the name Yahweh, it's telling us straight away we're not reading the original versions. Someone after the time of Moses has gone back and retold these stories and put the name Yahweh in to tell the reader to read them as God's stories. But he does it completely openly. And so we know right away these are not the original versions. He has changed them in some way. And that throws up the question, well, what were the original stories that he had on the desk when he did this edit? And there's a very broad consensus among Bible scholars that there was a significant edit or redaction done in the 6th century BCE that tied the whole of the Hebrew scriptures together into a single work and turned them into the story of God, a monotheistic text. So what did he have in Genesis 1 to 11? What was the original? What were they about if they weren't about Yahweh? Well, they were about the Elohim, and that's the earlier word for God.
Right, which is obviously plural, meaning more than one.
It is a plural word.
That connects to the let us make man in our image. And when people ask that, even today I hear people saying, well, God was talking to Jesus. I was like, well, okay. But then we have those other things that you've mentioned, which, it kind of, faith-wise, it's good to think that. But at the same time, you're leaving out the other aspects to which implies so much more. Can you fill us in on some of those?
Sure. People do say that because the word is confronting. It's shaped like a masculine plural. It sometimes takes plural verbs. It exhibits plural behaviors. Let us make humans to look like one of us, so on and so forth. And so I do hear sometimes from Christian believers saying, well, that language must be there because God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's the Christian way of thinking about God. But the Christian way of thinking about God came thousands of years after these texts were written. The authors of these texts were not Trinitarians, and the Hebrew Scriptures do not teach a Trinitarian vision of God at all. They don't even teach a binitarian vision of God. And this word Elohim behaves in some very odd ways, because in some texts it's translated as God, elsewhere gods in the plural, elsewhere demon, elsewhere demons in the plural, false god, false gods, land barons, kings, king, angel, angels. And so you have to ask, well, how do we know which way to translate it in which text? How does it mean all those things? And it's very clear that it's not a simple singular. It looks like it's a plural, and it does a lot of plural behavior. And in some of the Elohim texts, the Elohim seem to do some very negative and dark things. So I went back to the texts, I looked at the word, and I just couldn't avoid the question of, why is this a plural? What if these texts were edited and turned into Yahweh stories, because in the original version, Elohim was a plural.
Right.
There, the problem would be there are too many gods in the story, and the Yahwistic editor wanted to make the whole Bible a story of the one true God, the source of all things, the creator of everything. But the early versions were not. They were stories of Elohim. So I asked myself, well, what happens if I let it be a plural, if I translate Elohim as a plural each time it crops up with plural verbs and so on and so forth? And so I went through that exercise. And what happens is that the stories change, but they don't change in a random way. They change in a couple of ways that are very significant. And firstly, I found that all the moral anomalies of these texts, these questions, why would God do that? Why is he against humans becoming more intelligent? Why is he imposing a death penalty? Why is he genociding? So on and so forth. Right. They actually get resolved the moment you start reading these texts as Elohim in the plural instead of God in the singular. And I was going to say something else about the translation of it. It's just slipped my mind. I'll come back to it in a moment. But the other way it changes is that the Bible in its current form, if you read Elohim as God, it sort of stands as a contradiction of the neighboring stories of beginnings from Sumeria, from the Mesopotamian cultures. When we read the ancient texts on the cuneiform tablets that come from Sumeria, Babylonia, Assyria, Arcadia, we read some very familiar stories. We'll read stories that sound like Adam and Eve. This sounds like Cain and Abel. This sounds like the story of the upgrade of humans in Genesis 3. This sounds like the interbreeding with another species in Genesis 6. This sounds like the flood. This sounds like the Tower of Babel. This sounds like the limiting of human life that comes
with so much more detail attributed to it too. That makes it fascinating.
Much more detail. Exactly. So what we have in Genesis is a summary of those stories, which is one of the clues that the Sumerian is the earlier. But people will notice straight away, as soon as they read the Sumerian, there's a glaring difference. In the Sumerian and associated stories, they are not stories about God. They're stories about our ancestors' interaction with other species from elsewhere who intervened in human development. God doesn't appear in those stories. It's the stories of the humans and the sky people, or has been popularized, the humans and the Anunnaki.
Right.
As soon as you pluralize Elohim, the Bible stops being what it looks like, which is to say, oh, forget all that. This is what really happened. God did this, this, and this. You read it as Elohim. You pluralize it. You go to the root meaning of that word, which is the powerful ones. And all of a sudden, Genesis and the Sumerian stories line up and confirm each other. And you realize that the stories of the powerful ones in Genesis are a summary of the story of the sky people, or the Anunnaki, in the Sumerian stories. And they start confirming each other and adding detail to detail to detail. And one of the details that really gets amplified when you do that is that the other entities that we're bumping up against are extraterrestrial entities. It's another species. It's a more advanced population that's come to Earth, colonized Earth, and it may be a number of presences with different agendas, because we see some agendas that are sort of pro-human development, and some that are against. But they have a hands-on role in engineering Homo sapiens as we know ourselves to be, and upgrading us to the point that we enjoy today. So that was the real discovery for me when I sat down and just did the work of rereading the stories with the plural Elohim. All of a sudden, I was sent into the Sumerian world and realizing that Genesis lends credibility and asks us to listen to and interpret these ancient stories from Mesopotamia. And it's like taking the red pill in the Matrix. Suddenly you're in a different world and you can't go back. You can't go back to reading it the old way, because it's now coherent. It's now coherent. And an example, I mentioned how some of the moral anomalies get resolved when you do that. Right. When you get to Genesis 3 and you've got the story of the fall, in the current version of the story, God is against human beings becoming more conscious and more intelligent. Well, does that really make sense? I mean, in the story at that point, the humans were so unintelligent, they didn't even know they were naked.
Right.
And in the current translation, God doesn't want them any smarter than that. And when the serpent, whoever he is, breaks ranks and upgrades the humans, God, in our version, is so angry that he imposes a death penalty on the human beings and pushes them out of Eden. That's really odd, because it's hard not to see God as the villain in that story, at the stake as the goody, and you try and get your head around that when it's supposed to be a God story and teaching us about a God of love. That doesn't make sense. But you go into that story with Elohim in the plural,
And what you're now reading is a story of human beings existing on a planet where there are other powerful entities, the powerful ones, and the powerful ones are in conflict with one another as to how intelligent they want to make the human beings. Some want to make them more intelligent and fertile, so fledged species, they can reproduce and enjoy life. They want them that smart. They want them around for some reason. It doesn't quite spell it out, but it doesn't want them that smart.
Right, and that brings up a good point, sir, because the fact of many listeners to this show are aware of that, and those new ones who aren't, they'll get aware that these Elohim / Anunnaki were here much longer before they decided to fashion us in their image. And because you mentioned that, you know, they had arguments amongst themselves, they had their own factions, they had their own dealings on this planet before we were created already, with their own civilization from the other world, to which obviously they must have come, established for the means to what the stories tell us was for gold and story in the Nibiru and all that. We don't have to get into that, but it is part of that, correct? And then when they decided to make us, that's a lot of history being left out. Indeed.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And there are tiny vestiges of that storyline left in Genesis. A much fuller version of the story is in the Sumerian accounts. But the anomalies I'd spotted, and that I thought, oh, I've got to look at those again when I sit down and look at Genesis, because before I started writing Escaping from Eden, I had preached through the book of Genesis once again in a church that I was serving. Now, I've preached through the book of Genesis many times, and each time I preach it, I think, wow, this book is deeper than I thought it was. And the last time I preached on it, I thought, wow, I'm really scratching around on the surface here. I've got to drill down into this text. And one of the funny little verses that comes up that raised a red flag was that we're told, when Eden is described to us, we're told where it was and that it happened to be near some key mineral deposits, including for gold. And you'd have to read that and think, why on earth is that relevant? Why is that relevant to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where everything's provided for them? Why would they be interested in key mineral deposits? And then there's a verse in Genesis that says that
they did say we were created to till the earth.
That's what I was coming to. That's right. The humans were put to work. And in the current version, we think, oh, that's nice. That sounds like a bit of light gardening. But put the two together, I think it might not have been light gardening. And I'm very intrigued by the discovery in southern Africa of ancient gold mines. There's evidence that there was mining going on in southern Africa around 200,000 years ago. Right. And that's a very intriguing time frame, because that is long before Homo sapiens, as clever as us, have been around. And yet there were beings, there were hominids that were anatomically identical to us on the planet 200,000 years ago, just not as smart as us. And you put that together with the ancient mythologies, and you've got a population that would not be smart enough to farm for themselves, but they'd certainly be smart enough to work in someone else's mine. And so key mineral deposits, the Elohim put the humans to work, prehistoric mines, might be adding 2 and 2 and getting 5, but I think you can join the dots.
Right. It totally transforms the picture, and especially regarding to what we learned what Eden was. It was basically one of their main bases, for the lack of a better term. Correct?
I think so. It was a colony, and it was a place where it looks like we were engineered. And I heard you mentioning in the intro about we did not evolve from monkeys, But you know, there's a
Hershey bunker there.
there's a very intriguing detail that comes from Popol Vuh, which is the Mesoamerican narrative of the Mayan tradition. And it repeats many of the key ideas in Genesis, Sumerian, Mesopotamian accounts. It describes the arrival of these entities who hover over the waters, the darkness, same image that's there in Genesis and tablet, and they have a conversation. And the conversation is, how do we nurture life on this planet? How do we nurture life in the oceans, botanical life, animal life? And then they decide to make intelligent, sentient life, which is us. And the question they ask each other in the Popol Vuh is it time that we make avatars for ourselves to do the work for us and bring us our food? That's not a very glorifying story about the origins of humanity, if you think about it, but it is their story. And if you ask the question, why would a culture invent a story like that? Because it doesn't glorify anybody. It doesn't glorify humanity. It doesn't glorify the gods. It doesn't glorify the kings. What purpose could there possibly be in inventing such a demeaning story for humanity as that? And then we hear the echoes of it in the Sumerian, and then we hear the echoes of it in Genesis, and then we hear the echoes of it in ancestral narratives and mythologies all around the world. And many of them have some very intriguing parallels. And the thing that struck me most of all was there's a storyline of us being engineered from a primate in a series of experiments. And in the Popol Vuh, the experiments result in us and a few forest-dwelling apes. Now, that is really, really intriguing, because there, an ancient ancestral narrative and ancient mythology is relating us to apes centuries before Charles Darwin did. But it's not saying we are descended from apes. It's saying we and apes are descended from a common ancestor, the primate, and it was not by accident. It was by deliberate, careful engineering. And today in DNA research, there are scientists who are looking at very curious, anomalous data that would look like it supports that idea, that the difference between us and the apes is a very, very technical alteration that does not look like a random alteration. And at the very least,
the missing link.
Yeah, it's very intriguing. But once again, it's not that we're descended from apes. It's that we and apes are the result of intelligent experimentation that was done in our prehistory. But there is a memory of it in the world's mythologies. And it's there in Sumeria. It's there in the Popol Vuh. It's there in some of the African narratives. And it's there in the pages of Genesis.
Indeed, and that's the missing link that they're always looking for. You know, the attribute to apes or ape-like or Cro-Magnon and the various other species upon perfecting the tinkering, perfecting the experiments of genetic manipulation, to which they realized that they had to use themselves in more ways than one, which was not even amongst themselves. And there were arguments amongst themselves about that. And then that is part of the thing that was taken out. And that brings an interesting question of why take all that out? You think they would want all that information out? You would think that back then they really wanted us to know who they were. So I don't know if it was them that wanted that taken out of our history.
Yes. No, I don't think it would have bothered them that was in our history, because after all, the main lesson they'd want us to draw from history is that they were in charge. So I think that narrative has disappeared for other reasons. And there's an element of that story that is, I think, exciting for the average person to discover, and maybe worrying if you're in a position where you want to manage large human populations. What it is that in the stories of our engineering, it's there in the Bible, Sumerian, the Popol Vuh, in some of the African stories, we get upgraded in a number of stages.
Right.
In our development. Genesis 3 is one of those moments where we're upgraded. So now we are conscious that we're naked. We're more intelligent. We have a higher consciousness. And then in the Popol Vuh, it says we get upgraded to the point where we have higher cognitive abilities than at present. And our perceptual field is greater than at present. So we're able to do things like remote view. We have something like precognition. We've got greater telepathic ability. And in the Popol Vuh, it says, we've overshot the mark here. We've made these human beings just a bit too clever. They're going to be too hard to manage like this. And so we're downgraded to a lower level of ability where we can be clever enough to help the powerful ones, but not too much like them. Just like that phrase in the Bible, we don't want them too much like ourselves. Too much like
So
and
therefore,
with that,
we had to invent. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, the exciting thing about that is that if that's the story, it begins to answer some questions that occur to most people, which is why do we only use 10% of our brains and what's the other 90% of our brain for? Many people have glimpses of higher abilities, flashes of genius or flashes of precognition or flashes of telepathy, or whatever it might be. And when you have a few of those experiences or hear a few of those stories, you begin to ask, can we be better than this? Can we be cleverer than this? Can we be more conscious than this? And it's very intriguing to me that the cultures that have these stories, many of them also have mystical and shamanic traditions, which have always existed to expand human consciousness, to raise us up to a higher level of awareness, ability, intelligence. And I think that's the invitation that comes out of these ancient narratives. And there's a field of, go on.
No, I was going to say, or forgive my interruption here. Sometimes I tend to think, and I like, you know what I mean? So in order to get us to where they needed us, they created your Cro-Magnons, your other, like, various type species to get us to a stage to where they had to enable more of the essences of themselves within us while limiting us at the same time to get us to those points to where those things that you mentioned that we haven't experienced to some degree, they must have to 100% of the degree to where they had to put that in check in us and therefore limit us even through lifespan potentially, even though planetary distances and orbits may have a factor in that too. If you follow me for a second, listeners, let's try to grasp this, because then of which we are and what we become, we would be too much of a potential threat for them, or get so understanding and cognitive, we realize who they were, what they're doing, that we could, like you said, make ourselves more conscious and stuff to be like them, which is in a sense like the Tower of Babel incident as it was. Would that not be incorrect?
Yeah, that's right. That absolutely fits. In Genesis, you've got two moments where there's some conflict over how intelligent, conscious, technological we should be. One is in Genesis 3, where we get the upgrade from being more animal-like to being as we are today. And my guess is also that's when we became naked. That's when we stopped being hairy, for instance, and began looking a bit more like our creators. And that's the phrase, to look like one of us. And there's the concern in that story, they shouldn't be too much like one of us. And if they get too intelligent they will be. And then when we get to Genesis 11, where we've got the Babel story, especially when you read that alongside the Sumerian account, that is to do with how technological humanity and whoever else is on the planet has become. Because if you translate Babel or Babel, it means a gateway for the powerful ones, or a gateway to the powerful ones. When I first read that story,
maybe the traverse to the heavens, right?
Well,
therefore,
exactly.
to the technology, it could have been they were coming here in rocket ships and stuff, and maybe at some point we were coming to the point to where, again, our numbers would grow, and if we start becoming like them, and even that way, that's a strategic threat.
Exactly. And I think that's what it was about, because there's even more detail in the Sumerian account, because what happened at Babel was that 50 technicians dispatched 300 observers from Babel to their stations in the stars. So to me, that looks like either a launch place or a Stargate, which is what I think it was, a Stargate that would get us or the Anunnaki from here to their space stations. And another presence comes along and says, we can't have this. We can't have a spacefaring planet Earth. And what happens to the humans is incredibly disturbing, because it looks like the humans have constructed this. This is how technological human civilization has become. And we are bombed back into a state, that's a metaphor. We are taken back to a state where we can no longer speak to each other. We are now in a pre-language state that we can't communicate to each other anymore. Now, you read the current version of the story, and it sounds like we built a building that's too tall, and as a punishment for infringing the building code, instead of all speaking one language, we're now speaking Spanish, English, French, Italian, Mandarin, etc. That's not really what happens. The problem isn't the building too tall.
You're babbling. No one could understand each other.
No one can understand each other.
Basically,
and nothing happens after that.
Yeah, basically these beings were saying, you primates aren't that cute anymore. It's time to put your ass back on the ground and let you know what your place is.
Yeah, and it really looks like we're back in a place where we have to re-evolve into a species that can speak and have language, and nothing further happens. That's the end of the beginning. Genesis 11. When we get to Genesis 12, it's totally different. It's the world as we know. Now recovered language, and developed writing, engineering, civil engineering, and there's this great gap between Genesis 11 and Genesis 12. And it really looks like we have been taken down to a point where we have to re-evolve. Now, the violence of that is unimaginable. I mean, if you imagine being in that city and you have a family, and all of a sudden you and your wife can't communicate, you and your children can't communicate, all the technology you've depended on has now been destroyed. How are you even going to live? The cruelty of it is unimaginable. It's as if they've induced a stroke that has affected the brains of all the humans. Now, one of the reasons I had a passion in me to get this book out there is, if you credit that act of violence to God, what kind of God are you talking about? That you can see such a cruel and vicious act and say, I love that God and I worship him. In reality, it's not a God story. By the time you've begun decoding the Elohim word, you realize this is a moment where our contact with ET species was a very unhappy and a very violent one.
Obviously, yes. And even we were used in, you kind of hinted at already, we were also used in wars against them that, whose we belong to. Like, how we have the black race, we have the Asiatic races, we have Caucasian race. Like, why are there so many differences? You know what I say, sir? I think because of the various ones who were here, they wanted their own primitive humans, and therefore we each race would have that mark that would indicate who owned what, who owned who, in that sense. If you follow me, I hope.
I do. I do follow that idea. I've often wondered that myself. I haven't found any evidence for it in terms of DNA research or in terms of the human genome. But what is certainly clear when you're reading Genesis is that that is exactly how the Elohim regarded humans, that they each had their own colony of humans working for them. And then often they'd send the humans to war against each other. And the wars had nothing to do with the human beings. They had to do with one powerful one being in conflict or competition with another powerful one, presumably competition for resources, competition for minerals, whatever it was they were here for. They were bumping up against each other and then deploying humans as their foot soldiers. And I sometimes wonder if anything has actually changed since those days.
Right. It is fascinating to think about. It makes you wonder, and it makes you wonder now to the time and point we are at now, sir, regards to the Space Force, where the presidents, based on Brookings, we're coming to a time now when we must be told, not just acclamations through movies mixed with a bunch of crap and part truths, but now we're at a time where we must be told, and now we're creating a Space Force where they say, both the presidents, again, based on Brookings, that there's a threat coming from deep space.
Yeah, it really it rings bells, doesn't it? Because this is rather similar to what happened under President Ronald Reagan.
Right.
He got pretty close to saying exactly that, didn't he?
Yes, and in fact, he said, isn't there an alien presence already among us, already here? You know, it's indeed. Like, so, I mean, none of this, you can't make this crap up. I mean, once you start putting the dots together, and it makes you wonder then, all of this has been suppressed and kept from us in the classifications based upon that pre-600 BC agenda to keep this from us, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there have been a number of moments where this awareness that we are in a populated universe and we're part of a bigger cosmic family. Some of the family we might be on good terms with, some of them less so. And there have been a few moments that I can think of through history where very deliberate action has been taken to get rid of these stories. I mean, if you think about what was destroyed when Europeans went into South America and destroyed all the priestly knowledge that was there. And what we've discovered since with the Popol Vuh, for instance, and with what we're learning about Mayan culture, is that there was a knowledge of the cosmos that was surprisingly developed that would have been silenced by all that cultural extinction, the murdering of the priesthoods, the burning of old literature, and then
and history, wiping out of history, that it becomes forgotten.
Exactly, that's right. And then there was a moment, I'm trying to remember the name of, it was one of the Roman emperors who basically illegalized all non-Christian religions, and that involved burning a lot of
Nero
as well. It was somebody else, and getting rid of ancestral narratives and other texts. That was another moment. You mentioned the redaction of the Bible in the 6th century BCE. That's another. And then there was a moment right at the beginning of church history where it was done quite emphatically, because at the beginning of Christian history, for the first 1.5 centuries, the question of whether we were alone in the universe and what the Elohim were was part of the mainstream conversation of the church. And there were significant church fathers, people like Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Marcion, who were very, very affirming of Plato's explanation of human origins. Now, his explanation is quite different to what we get taught in school or what we get taught in Sunday school. He believed in God as the source of all things, the creator of everything, but he also believed that there were other entities who had intervened in human development, particularly with a view to upgrading our intelligence, our consciousness, our technological ability. And these church fathers had no problem affirming that story because they saw that as being in line with the Elohim stories. They didn't really take them as God stories. And so that was all part of the mainstream conversation in the Roman Empire and early Christianity until about 144 AD, when some votes went a particular way. Marcion, who was the most outspoken of all of the church fathers I mentioned, was excommunicated. We don't have any of his works that have survived somehow or other, which is amazing because the churches that were in line with him were across a huge geographical area, but we don't have anything left of what he wrote because what he was saying had to be gotten rid of. And the signal was there. This is not permitted within Christianity. These are questions we do not ask. That continued all through the centuries. In 1600,
so like the archons in the Star Trek thing, I don't know if you heard that in the opening, in the news section.
Yes.
All right. So maybe that knowledge is there, but only to a select individuals, because you mentioned, not Lucas, though he'd probably fall into it too, Carl Sagan and others, Roddenberry and others, and bringing forth that the archons, that the God isn't really there no more, but it's a computer programming. But they would have these acolytes, these priesthoods that may be aware of this knowledge or how to access and or even communicate, for all we know, if we up the ante a little bit, to where this control system could continue on. If that's true, then they still have something to fear from us.
Well, that's right. And the knowledge that we destroy never gets wholly destroyed. Very often, it's actually secreted away in museums and libraries, and so there would always be some group, some esoteric society, some level of government that would have some awareness of these other narratives and the credibility of them for it to resurface. And so some of the script writers who come up with these wonderful stories, whether it's scripts for Star Trek or The Outer Limits or The Twilight Zone, or Stargate, Battlestar Galactica,
right.
Planet of the Apes, or even you get into Tarzan, Jungle Book. They're telling these stories because they know them, because they're either part of an esoteric, or they've been given information, and so they tell a little bit of the story again, how we remember. But I think the Vatican would have a lot of documents, cultures where the Roman Catholic Church for centuries would tell another story. And one of the reasons I mention that is because of what happened in 2009, when Pope Benedict XVI, the most conservative pope in my lifetime, convened or called upon the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to convene a 5-day colloquium. And it was 5 days, closed sessions, but they advertised for a year before it happened, so we'd all know what they were discussing. And what they were discussing was, quote, the theological implications of contact with other civilizations. And then they came out with some amazing statements following that. Some senior spokespeople came out, and Jose Gabriel Funes, who's the director of the Vatican Observatory, said we need to be ready sooner than anyone expects to embrace a brother or sister alien. And when I heard this, I thought, sooner? What do they know? It really gave the appearance that they were wanting to get in ahead of some other disclosure that they thought might be coming. And so they could say to the faithful, don't worry, we discussed this already. You remember there's no issue. Another spokesman came out and said, this was Corrado Balducci, who was a senior exorcist for the Roman Catholic Church, and he said when people report close encounters with ETs, it's not a demonic phenomenon they're describing. It's not a psychotic episode they're reporting. They are describing contact with a totally other kind of entity that deserves serious study.
And we see that in the biblical scriptures as it is, at least in that part of the regard, like Ezekiel and some others where they experienced flying craft.
Yes, that's quite right. That's
Never
quite right.
And this is the same time, too, where I forget who it was that came out. I think it was the Pope. Was it around that time where he says that we should embrace him and that they're baptizable?
Yes, I think that was Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno. He's actually American, so it's probably Guy rather than Guy. But it was him who said that, and it was a really funny and a provocative thing to say.
Yes.
But what he was really emphasizing, and he did say this,
is that we're not alone.
First of all, we're not alone, and we shouldn't be thinking in terms of them being aliens. We have to realize they're all creatures of the same creator. We're probably related, and they're, interestingly, in DNA research, there are a lot of top scientists who hold to the idea that our genetic coding came from somewhere else. And we always wonder why aliens look somewhat like us, you know, a head, a torso, 2 arms and 2 legs. And there are some possible answers to that question. But Guy Consolmagno was basically saying, we're not alone in the universe. We are part of a wider family, and we have to ask questions about where that puts us in relation to our classical ideas of God and our place in the cosmos. And when you hear people of that authority in the Roman Catholic world, because when they come out in the Roman Catholic world and say these things, they are really expecting to be taken seriously. They're really speaking for the Pope at that moment. Right. And when you consider that only 400 years before, the same organization was torturing and burning people to death in public as a way of telling people not to say those things or ask those questions, that represents a massive shift. And you have to ask why. Why the shift?
Yeah, it does make me wonder. And again, because we're going to be having to face them, and they could either know that we have to come aware and adapt and create space forces to deal with them and the potential threats coming from deep space, which means what? They're coming back. And that brings us up to something else. But if it's cool with you, we're at the top of the hour. We could go to a break. We could come back and get into that.
All right. Let's do that.
All right. Excellent. And everyone, as you know the motto, pack 'em and smoke 'em. What I tell you, you're definitely going to need them. And it's going to help wake you up when we come back on the Martian Revelation.
I'll be back.
Don't run. We are your friends.
Everyone, is Francis, your host of Collision Course on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Every Sunday from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern, you'll join me and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in our solar neighborhood. Not just that, though, we're on a mission to uncover and discover the truth about our place in the universe. This week, February 9th, will be a great interview with Ben Davidson from Suspicious Observers and Yoda Natsu, a traveling researcher. The discussion topic, super solar flares and where we are in our sun's situation currently, in the future, in the past, and what may happen. Join us from 8 to 10 p.m. this Sunday on Revolution Radio at freedomsips.com for the next episode of Collision Course with your host, Francis Walsh. Clear skies.
I listened to the end of the day tonight, the show. I would like to hear more about Miss Oldwin. You talked about a lot of stuff, but I didn't hear much about Miss Oldwin. Maybe next time, you do a good job. I just want to say thank you to the end of days, but next time, let's talk about Miss Oldwin a little more.
What's up, boys and girls? I'm Michael Deacon, just here to remind you, if you enjoy shows like the one you are hearing now, The Martian Revelation, I'm opening Pandora's Box live every Saturday night at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Go to michaeldeacon.com for your preferred platform. Don't forget, the end of days are upon us. Make sure you are on the right side when the end is here.
Shock the monkey. All you monkeys shocked on the Martian Revelation. This is the realities that's upon us now. Again, hopefully you pack them and smoke them because, like I said, you're definitely going to need them. And we're with our special guest, awesome guest, Mr. Paul Anthony Wallace. Be sure to go there, www.paulanthonywallace.com, and make sure you check the book there. Click on it and pre-order that book, Escaping from Eden. Doesn't that bring already? He's not even telling us that much about the book, and already we could grasp it. We want to grasp it and read it and tell that title, Escaping from Eden. Because look, the analogies of even the Tower of Babel is an analogy of what the time was, of what we were a part of and who we were a part of, and the world that was left behind, and the ruins that we're digging up all around the world today. All these vast technologies. How the hell do we do that shit? Well, Mr. Paul Anthony Wallace, I think, just helped shock you monkeys, didn't he? I mean, right? Am I right on that track there, Mr. Wallace? And not only that, it is also known by the Anunnaki through the Sumerians. Lamu, Mars, was also a way station for these beings, these Benai Elohim, Anunnaki, to bring the materials to Mars, where Mars was also done up, and even stated in their annals that a face was made representing Alalu, the first one that left Nibiru, came here to escape, and then thought that he would rebuild himself up. And, well, he kind of bit the schlong off of the king to, punish him because he didn't beat him in a wrestling match. And I think Alalu got a bad deal of what he could have had even here on Earth, but he was exiled once again, this time to Mars, to where the schlong he bit off. And I'm not being pornographic. Ask Mr. Wallace. This is in the annals of what their readings are. And of Anu, he bit it off of Anu. They wrestled. And Anu said, yeah, well, I'll get your goat more ways than one. You won't have any more kids. You won't have any more heirs. And he ingested it. Well, it poisoned him, and he wound up dying on Mars. They created a face. Now, many people like to say, the face inside down here is Alalu's. No, it's not. There's other faces of Mars, as which has already been proven and attested and validated by Dr. John Brandenburg, soon to be, I hope, by Mr. Richard C. Hoagland, where all of this down through time is going to come into convergence and a knowledge. The face of Cydonia does not represent what was stated, the face that was made as the tomb of Alalu. It was supposed to be half his face, half eagle face. What we see there at Cydonia is not a half eagle face. It's half representing of a lion through like the Aztec Maya iconography, split art graphs like George Haas and others and myself have been into and researching for years. But especially the extensive work put forth by Haas. But it shows a hominid side that it's a human face. No, it's not a human face. It's hominid, but it's saurian. And it looks apish saurian, which is kind of interesting. And the other half looking more like a lion. Okay, so which means what? If that's there and we're hinted at a face and we're having secret faces of Mars being put to us in a video as deep background, which never aired in the United States, people. Why? You can't air state secrets. That's why it aired in Germany. Most likely East Germany, wink, wink, as well as Russia. Now, it brings us that tie. So now down through time when we're coming to these interesting conclusions, which isn't really a conclusion, it's a reawakening of forgotten knowledges that they were up there too. And look at the amazing stuff they did there. Yeah, the gravity's different, things could be done, but was it originally them that did a lot of that? Because like Dr. Brandenburg said, war happened there where they were nuked in the past. Listeners to this show could appreciate, but maybe it was them at the same time, but the time frame Dr. Brandenburg puts forth is much longer than the time frame, at least of what in the annals here on Earth that have been dug up in Nineveh and the cuneiform tablets states. So maybe they came upon a world that has been already once inhabited and whoop-de-dooed throughout the solar system, and they happened upon it later. I mean, look, there's so many pieces to the puzzle. But what's fascinating about this is that Mr. Paul Anthony Wallace, Escaping from Eden, I think he's just scratching the surface. And, he said it himself. And I appreciate where he's going. I like I said to you, sir, privately, sir, you are definitely a historical factor where our footsteps are not our own. where we're making our fate and your part, as well as mine and others, have a big part to play in what that future is going to come out to be. But thank you for being back on with us, sir. And if anyone would like to call in on the timeline, why not? 202-684-6955. Odin, I hope you got your gates on and not messing with Aphrodite. But 202-684-6955. One more. 202-684-6955. So again, www.paulanthonywallace.com and click on that book, Escaping from Eden. And that book is going to be heard and seen much more in the upcoming days, I believe, on this show, hopefully, and pre-ordering it. So it's not even out yet. But look what he's bringing forth now. It just want you to get that book and check it out and check out the other things. PaulAnthonyWallace.com. All right, Mr. Wallace, sorry about that. We are back. And so am I correct in that assessment of the analogy, therefore, of what we went over, of why people are finding these marvelous things around the world, how it could have been done? These are things that obviously we must have been helping with at some point, and even was around before us, pre-Adamite civilization. And once we were here, we were basically not so cute anymore. We had to be knocked back down to our place. And now we're just digging the ancient wonders.
Yes, I think when we look at the story of humanity, there are a few moments where we have to acknowledge there's a gap in our information. And so there's a gap in our information with regard to our upgrade as conscious, intelligent, technological species. And that was the thing I noticed. I remember when I was 5 years old having questions about that, because it's very obvious that we are a kind of animal. We're similar to some of the other animals, the apes in particular, but we're very different as well. Why are we so different? Why are we so ill-adapted to planet Earth? You know, the animals live out in the wild and have a nice life. If I try and live out in the wild, I'll probably be dead within 3 nights. I'll have died of exposure.
You almost were. You were chased by a rhinoceros. And before you go on, can you tell us about that? What is it like being chased by a rhinoceros that wants to horn you?
Well, it's a little bit less scary when you're inside a van, which we were. So I wasn't standing out in a field with a rhino straight at me. It was myself and my family were in a little minibus that was driving around looking for wildlife. And the driver had just taken us by this white rhino, which was with its calf. And the driver was just saying, oh, this is a very placid kind of rhino. And as soon as it said those words, it decided not to be placid anymore and charged right at us. And they are big, heavy animals. And if it had impacted our little minibus, we would have been in big trouble. They had very poor eyesight. So it had to get very, very close before it realized we were physically larger than it. And so it decided not to hit us. And just sort of huffed and puffed.
Thank God for its primal instincts, then.
Yes, indeed.
Right?
Indeed.
Yeah, so that missing link, like you said.
Back to what we were saying. We're clearly ill-adapted to life on planet Earth. We have not evolved to a state of perfection. We've evolved to a point where we can't live out in the wild. We are dependent on technology, on being able to make fire, live indoors, wear clothes, cook our food, all the rest of it. And all that awareness, even as a young child of 5, I thought, that doesn't make sense. How did that happen? And there are many ancient narratives, ancestral narratives from around the world that give an account of how that happened, that it was through an external intervention that we became changed and that we were assisted. So you go to some of the Native American mythologies, and they have stories about beings coming from the stars and teaching their ancestors, all our ancestors, how to farm and about hygiene and how to live as a civilization. You go to Africa and Mesoamerica, and again, the stories are there. Other beings showing us how to farm and how to make beer. The vital essentials of life, food and beer. That's how to live on planet Earth. And I love those stories because that is it would seem to me, a benign interaction. The Mohicans have an amazing story of a time in their prehistory when something had happened that had altered the climate or the lie of the land, and they were living, I think, higher up in the mountains in a colder environment. And then another being was manifested to them to help them know how to get the food they needed, how to live in that environment. And sometimes when we think about ETs and ET contact, we go straight to, some nightmarish Independence Day, body snatchers, Mars attacks kind of vision, and that's how we perceive ETs, or this is why Trump's working up an army to fight them off. But some of the narratives from our distant past talk of a more benign interaction with some, because it seems to me that even in the pages of Genesis, there are clues that there are different kinds of ET presence that have come in contact with us. Back in, I think it was 2012, Prime Minister Medvedev, the Russian Prime Minister, he'd just done an interview, and he was still on mic, and the interviewer asked him about a question about ET contact. And you might remember this, Gary, this thing he said that got recorded. It was up on YouTube for a while. It may still be there. Is this ringing bells?
You're not talking about with Obama.
Go on with the story. Tell me if you recognize it, because he was asked this question about ET contact, and he said, look, I'm just going to say this once. There's a Russian documentary called Men in Black. Not the Will Smith movie. It's an actual documentary about ET contact. And he said basically what's in that documentary is true. When you become Prime Minister of Russia, you're given a folder detailing the 11 species that we're in contact with.
Right. And he listed like 57 species or something.
Well, I think he said 11. That was my recollection. I have to go and check now. But the way it was responded to was really interesting because it didn't get debunked by authorities. The president, Putin, didn't come on and say, he'd had too much to drink or he was joking. They made no comment at all. Others came on and said, it must be a joke. But I think you can still see the footage. It does not look like he's joking at all. And even if you don't take his comments seriously, if you listen to the world mythologies, it seems very likely that there are a range of ET presences that are in contact with us, some with a benign intention for us, some perhaps with a neutral intention, they're interested in planet Earth, and some with a negative intention. And I would suggest that a lot of that contact has been there consistently at a higher government level for at least 70 years, which is post-Roswell, post the National Security Act of 1947 signed by Truman that classified all UFO and ET research. And it seems to me
that means they're still present. That would be the ultimate reason of that too.
It would suggest to me a presence, it would suggest contact, and it would suggest some kind of stability in that. So if all of a sudden we need a Star Force or whatever it's being called, and we worry, thank you, Space Force, is it because we're worried that stability might not be so stable? I'm only guessing, but it seems the logic of that suppression of information suggests that there is some kind of contact, collaboration, some kind of stability, and that there must be some kind of an arrangement among the ET presences and our government representatives who've been in contact. That's me guessing. I don't have any privileged information, but just what's in the public domain. We try and interpret it.
It kind of makes sense too. Right, and that kind of makes sense too. But if we could go back for a second, because you brought about the primitive aspects of the life on this planet, how we not match, and even upon them coming in this planet originally, at least the B'nai Elohim and or Anunnaki before us, what the world was like and what must have went through their heads as seeing the life here, and even the primitive form of hominids. Now, I'm sure they must have considered the panspermia effect like we are familiar with today. What do you think their thoughts would be on that? Or do you think they would most likely be more knowledgeable of that and accepting of that, of how advanced and knowledgeable of the cosmos that they must be, that would be, they wouldn't be surprised of finding those things here?
Yes, I think there is a clue in the narrative that repeats all around the world of hybridization, hybridization of the beings that came with our primate ancestor, and then hybridization with human beings. And that's there in, gosh, probably virtually every culture around the world has a version of that story. I mean, the Greek legend tells of it. Norse legend tells of it. It's there in Genesis 6. It's there in the Sumerian stories. Now, for those beings to have the idea that they could hybridize with us, they must have had some awareness that there was a compatibility between us. You know, we must have been fairly closely related for them to think that was remotely possible. I'm thinking in human terms, obviously. I'm thinking about how we do genetic modification, how we do genetic engineering.
So basically what you're saying is like basic elements of what must be out there. If they know how to mess around with that, it must be basic, maybe to like to modify or change things, or in order to figure something out, let alone understand it, to figure it out. Basic elements like on Mars, like Dr. Gil Levin, you know, life is universal, but is it, you know, the chirality of it, right-handed or left-handed, that would be amazing things of where on Mars or some other world, life may take form on that regard compared to such other world. But if one has the understanding, they could manipulate either or to such and such conditions that would benefit them, or of where they would want life in essence to go, right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, I discovered when I was researching for Escaping from Eden that the conversation about our ET origins is had far more confidently and more openly when you go to the community of those scientists who are involved in DNA research. You know, a lot of people, if you talk about, do we have ET roots, do we have ET origins, this is a completely baffling and strange story to them, but it's been part of the conversation of DNA research for 60 years. Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of the double helix structure of DNA, was a supporter of the idea of panspermia. Back in the 60s, you had people like Leslie Orgel, Carl Sagan arguing for that, supporting that idea, Fred Hoyle. And what's interesting about the idea of panspermia is that the genetic coding for intelligent conscious life has been disseminated throughout the cosmos, throughout the galaxy, and that when it lands on a hospitable planet, it generates the kind of life forms that we're familiar with. And if that's the case, it would give some explanation as to how beings could come from another part of the galaxy and expect to find anything compatible with themselves. My suspicion is that they were aware of that they expected that. They fully expected to arrive on a planet that had life forms that they could farm, eat, and then hybridize with the most developed of them.
Now that brings the I'm sorry, sir. Finish your statement.
I just think without that background expectation, you wouldn't do it. And they clearly had some notion that they were close enough to our primate ancestors that they could hybridize something that would be very highly functional.
Right. Now that brings us to what you mentioned, what I played earlier. before Archie Bunker there, and I only gave a small taste of the basics of Gilgamesh. All right, he was aware, he was knowledge, and that's pretty historically known that many people would like to see or find. Is there any attributes or importance of Gilgamesh that is being either sought or being very important to this crucial discussion?
Yes, absolutely. Gilgamesh is a great opportunity for us to test this whole idea that we have got a history of genetic contact with non-humans, because as you rightly pointed out, in the Sumerian account, Gilgamesh was a crossover king. In the Sumerian stories, rulership over humans begins with the sky people. They come, they carve up they create the human population, carve it up, manage it. They're all in charge of different bits. And then at some point, the rulership gets handed over to human kings. That storyline repeats in mythologies all around the world, including in the Bible. Of course, King Saul is the first human king in the Bible. And Gilgamesh is the crossover king in the Sumerian story. He's part human, part sky people. So goes the story. Well, we had the opportunity to test the veracity of that. In 2003, it was the second Iraq invasion, if I'm remembering correctly, under George W. Bush. When the Allied forces went into Iraq, within a matter of days, an archaeological team had gone in to a site that had been identified through new technology, soil magnetization technology, identified as probably the site of the tomb of King Gilgamesh. Now, the scientist who is behind this project, his name is Jörg Fassbinder. He was from the Bavarian Department of Historical Monuments in Munich. He headed up this team, and it was his team that had the protection of the Allies to go in. They went in. They found the site. He went on the BBC and said, "We're 99% certain we have found the tomb of King Gilgamesh, the subject of the oldest story in human history." And he didn't use these words, but in the story, he is a human, sky people, Anunnaki hybrid.
And now, they found the actual body?
Well, we have 99% probably found his tomb, he said. And then, once they'd found it, the war ended within, I don't know what it was, a couple of weeks. Mission accomplished, apparently. Was what was said, and we pulled out. We didn't hear any more about Gilgamesh until 2005, I think it was, when Jörg Fassbinder made some quiet little announcement in a French magazine, the Dossier des Sciences des Origines, or something, some title like that, that's interested in origins and archaeology. And he said, we decided not to investigate any further because of the instability in the area, everything that's going on. We decided just to bury the site in order to preserve it. And nothing seems to have been said. I'm not aware of anything been said on it since. So apparently we discovered the most important archaeological find in history in 2003. We had Allied forces protecting a Bavarian team to make sure they could get to it. And then in the 17 years since, we decided not to investigate any further. I don't really find that credible. And
right. They must have got what they needed and then sealed it up, like Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, that's right. Either sealed it up or got what they needed, took it home, and then hid the site. Because there's plenty of anecdotal evidence from American forces who went in that a big part of that mission was to take stuff out of Iraq, presumably back to the States, from archaeological sites. Now, that was not, the official reason for going into Iraq, of course.
Right.
But it was on the top of the list for certain units that went in to go to archaeological sites and get these things that we're pretty sure they're there. We know what we're looking for, grab them, take them. And this site was one of them. So personally, I think we found it. I think we probably did do the DNA testing. That is the obvious thing you'd want to do, because if you DNA test Gilgamesh, you can either verify or falsify the story that he was a hybrid. Falsify it, then okay, well, fair enough. It's still very interesting. He's still the subject of the world's oldest story from the world's oldest known culture. But if you verify it, well, then the whole of our history changes.
And then they could have got the means potentially to how to duplicate. Remember, General Mark Milley in 2016, Mr. Wallace, to a graduating class of officers and such on the East Coast somewhere, he said if the beginnings of, the early 1900s was complex, all the way up to the wars in Vietnam, blah, 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 was complex. The year 2016 was entirely very complex, and what they were going to be facing now would be terrorists, hybrid armies, little green men. And just a couple months ago, sir, President Trump had named him now. This is the guy that said that. A couple months ago, he named him now he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff now, General Mark Milley. Very, very interesting. And in a way, hybrid armies, what was on their mind? I believe they did find it. I believe they got what they needed. If we're not creating them, they got something that maybe that we could use to help fight back, or the hybrid armies coming from space. Since many people say abductions, say, well, they take their babies and stuff like that, or even things that in Dulce and other places, potentially thereof, creating these things. Years ago on this show, I had a Dr. Gordon Gallup on. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but you might want to at least look into him, sir. I'm going to try to get him back on the air because he tried to get a patent, and I told him how futile that would ultimately be, but I appreciated and respected his passion for wanting to do so, because I titled that show, Birth of the Planet of the Apes. He was wanting to stop the chimerization of where that would lead. What we had as a figurehead for an analogy and a comparison, which was a freak, Oliver, the human walking upright ape who smoked, who also liked the, pardon the French, bang his owner. I mean, this ape was something else, but it was like a figurehead of where he wanted to make a patent in order to try to stop this around the world. And I said to him, sir, I don't see how it would stop it around the world. If anything, Birth of the Planet of the Apes is already in effect. Therefore, when I hear General Mark Milley, hybrid armies, I was more than correct. But it doesn't just have to deal with apes. And I was fascinated since a kid with Planet of the Apes. If you only knew, I'm not going to get into all that now. But what do you think of that aspect of what General Mark Milley said in line where all this is going in your research and in our bizarre discussion here?
Well, a few years ago, I read the book, I think it's called Men Who Stare at Goats.
Okay.
And it's, I forget the name of the author now, but it was written by a guy who had basically gone visiting some people who had been involved in secret and special ops for the U.S. Defense, and he had found people who he considered to be very eccentric, working on technologies that he thought to be ridiculous, and he made a bit of a joke out of all these people. And I read the whole book. It was very interesting, but I really disliked the book because I think he was making a mockery of people who the army had used to try and develop technologies that we would think very strange or outlandish or unlikely or impossible or whatever it might be. they had been used for that. And some of their work had been taken up and some of it hadn't gone anywhere, and some of it seemed a bit flaky. But the point was, I was upset that he had ridiculed them, because their work really had happened, and it had been challenging, it had been disturbing, and it actually hinted at the fact that there are all kinds of technologies that our armies and our intelligence agencies are always experimenting with to get the upper hand in international conflicts and in covert operations. And I think I would share your lack of confidence that getting a patent for these things is probably the right way to go, especially if you're a civilian. But it's without question that there would be technologies being worked on that would be shocking and surprising to any civilian that's being done by intelligence and by military around the world. I discovered just recently, this might seem a bit tangential, but it makes the point of how far out some of these explorations might be. But back in the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I set up British intelligence for the first time, and set up spy operations. And obviously their desire was to be able to spy on their enemies. But like most governments, they wanted to be able to spy on countries far away, and they were very interested in spying on what was happening in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land. One of the technologies that they began working on immediately was something that might not sound technological at all. It was remote viewing. And it's because they couldn't afford to get people in all these countries all around the world. International travel and communications were not what they are now in the 1500s. And so they thought, if we can develop the ability to remote view, what an advantage that will give. If we know what the king of such and such is doing, if we know what their army is doing. And when I came to the John Ronson book, that's his name, Men Who Stare at Goats, I was therefore not surprised to discover that there are remote viewing units working for countries today in developing our military capacities. So to a lot of people, you say remote viewing and they'll think that's hippie nonsense, and not know that our governments invest money into that kind of thing. And as soon as you hear one thing like that and realize one thing like that is going on, then you come back to the kind of statements you were quoting and you realize there's something behind it. It's not just a quirky off-the-cuff remark. It relates to something real that's been taken seriously.
Yes, indeed. And Dr. John Brandenburg has attested on this show. Listeners to this show could appreciate that back in the day, even that Dick Hoagland was involved in the Mars studies put forth by the government, DOD, and et cetera, that right next door, literally, the next door down the hall, they had the remote viewing going on, and that was put forth by a declassified piece put forth about the remote viewing, about what they seen on Mars. Mars was projection and very much a part of, at least regards to that aspect of remote viewing. So yes, sir, it's obviously it must be very real and taken very seriously. And he said when they were giving their assessments to the government individual, he was very intent, writing word for word, make sure the dots and T's were, all written correct as it was, and that's very fascinating of where this goes now. So now we're starting to get a lot of questions in here, and wow, there's some questions building up. I would like to get to, and maybe in about 5 or 10 minutes, we'll go to our last break and then we'll get into more of those questions. But is it all right if I start getting into some of the questions now? Sure. Okay, but Raphael on vk.ru, I guess in Russia, we got a lot of Russian listeners. Raphael on vk.ru asked if you have researched what part of this creation or existence talks about the region known as Russia. Now, before you answer, some of these questions may have already been things we might have been covered already, or we might not have covered at all, but I like to ask out of the fairness and of the listener and include them for their time on here as well. But go ahead, sir.
So can you repeat that question?
Yes, sir. Raphael, on vk.ru asks if you have researched what part of this creation or existence talks about the region known as Russia. I guess maybe where does Russia fit into this? In other words, I'm trying to, what I get out of it, where does Russia fit into this, if any? And is there any connections to the old land? I would say probably throughout this all. I'm going to say probably yes.
No, nothing in my research really delved into that. The only sort of connections I've made with Russia in escaping from Eden was what I was just saying about Prime Minister Medvedev and what he was able to speak openly without any kind of condemnation or reprisal. I find that very interesting. I did wonder at the time of the 2009 colloquium that Pope Benedict XVI called, it gave the appearance that they were expecting some kind of disclosure from another authority and they wanted to get in ahead. And I wondered if that might have been Russia, with any operations that they were doing or any contact that they'd had. I know that there was more open reporting of what looked like a UFO presence around Chernobyl, for instance, at the time of the meltdown, all the way back when that happened. I think I'd be very interested to hear what narratives have been maintained in Russia, because there's a very strong shamanic tradition, although Russians wouldn't use that language, in Russian culture and in Eastern Orthodoxy. They have very well developed modalities of conscious breathing, for instance, for heightening consciousness. And I wonder if that might be connected with other narratives that have to do with our origins and our cosmic family. But I haven't actually done any research in that direction. So if your questioner knows any more, I'd love to hear from him, and maybe he can give me some leads.
That's right. And at the end of the show, we will ask you how these people could contact you or whatnot, but not at the moment. So the next question is from Travis on Facebook, who asks if you have any accurate location on where Eden is, and why are people not looking to Venus for civilizations? Well, that's a twofold different question, but go ahead.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions. I haven't particularly looked into the question of the exact location. It's intriguing because both the Sumerian accounts and the Genesis account do give geographical pointers as to where Eden would have been.
Tigris, Euphrates, Gihon, and the Gihon. If we can find a piece of Gihon, we have a good chance.
So exactly. So it names some locations that we can correlate to locations today. And then there are some mystery locations thrown in as well. So there's still a little bit of a puzzle there to pinpoint the place. But we know the region. We know that we're talking about the Mesopotamian part of the world, and that there's an agreement in different traditions that point in that direction. I didn't probe that particularly because it didn't seem to be the most interesting detail. But I guess if we were able to go there and have the freedom to dig around for artifacts, that might be a reason to pinpoint that. But the way my book unfolded, it was the stories that came out of Eden that I was most interested in, because they have such corroboration around the world in different cultures to say, yes, something happened there, and it had to do with ET contact, and it had to do with our engineering, and it had to do with our great leap forward from being people who'd been on the planet for 200,000 years, living an animal life, and then all of a sudden we're farmers. And that was another of those anomalies that many people know about and have question marks about. And that location has been a very interesting one to probe. It would be a reason to look for Eden, but the location that has been probed is not far from that part of the world in Karakadag, in what's now southeast Turkey, where we've pinpointed where all modern farming seems to have started. So I can see why people would want to go to Eden, but the actual location wasn't something I particularly homed in on.
Right. That makes sense. And I don't know if you want to answer this. Why are people not looking to Venus for civilizations? I don't know if you could attribute to anything for that.
Well, it's not something I know a lot about, other than that I know that there are ancestral narratives that point to Venus and say there's a civilization there. That's why people have these question marks about it, its place in ancient mythology. When we observe Venus today, it doesn't look like any kind of environment that could sustain life that would look anything like us. Right. But I wonder how old these mythologies are, because it would be part of mainstream science to say that our solar system has not always been in the shape it's in right now. And the planets haven't always been in the locations that they're in right now. And maybe Venus now, what was Venus then, are not the same kind of place at all. And maybe that might give an explanation as to why we have these stories about Venus that don't match the Venus that we know.
Right. So in that sense, what I think to sum that answer up is that more exploration, input, more data, number 5.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
But Russell on Africa TV, Africa.tv, not Africa, Africa.tv, but it must be Africa, I assume, asked if there is any information about advanced technology that could be discovered, and did the creators also make the animals on this planet as well? I think there's a good chance of that, but go ahead, sir.
Yeah, that's a great question. The theory of panspermia, which I love for 2 reasons. I love it because it enjoys such credible scientific support from the scientific community. I also love it because it gives a nuts and bolts expression to a powerful philosophical idea that I get from Plato. Plato believed in God, and he believed in external interventions in our planetary history. He believed in God in the sense of an ultimate source of all things, and he saw that as being a source that was conscious, harmonious, intelligent, orderly, a state of a unified field of love. He used all that kind of language to describe what he believed God was. And then he said the material universe came into being in order for that consciousness to express itself. That consciousness and intelligence sort of fractalized into the material universe so that God could experience God, consciousness could experience consciousness. And it's a very beautiful and powerful idea, but as soon as you ask, well, what would that look like in nuts and bolts terms, in material terms, and it's panspermia, that's what it looks like. That the genetic coding for conscious, intelligent life is disseminated throughout the cosmos, and then it lands on harmonious environments, hospitable environments, and it generates forms of life. That might be sufficient to generate animal life, but in the Popol Vuh story,
which can also be modified, but go ahead.
Which can be modified. Yeah, exactly. That's right. And if I only had the book of Genesis, that's what I'd be saying, that it formed that way and then we got modified. But if I go to a different story, if I go to the Popol Vuh, When the beings arrive from somewhere else, and we're talking about the figures known as Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl in the Mesoamerican stories, they have a conversation that says, how do we nurture life on this planet? Life in the oceans, botanical life, animal life, sentient life. And so the suggestion in that mythology is they were hands-on in developing animals as well as us. If you go to the Zulu mythology of Unkulunkulu, they have an amazing story, and it sounds like a number of movies I've seen that says life came to planet Earth from somewhere else, and it came as developed forms. And so it talks about these, it describes them like seed pods arriving on the planet, and the creatures. Say again.
Or arcs, like
yes,
for people.
That's right. Exactly, or stasis pods, as we might call them today. But they describe them as seed pods, and then the animals would gestate and develop inside the pods, and then when they were ready to be birthed, the pods burst open, and animals were released, and the first humans were released as well. And that's a really counterintuitive kind of story for an ancient African culture to produce, but that was the story they produced of distinct animal forms coming to planet Earth from somewhere else. So there's another possibility.
Yes, indeed.
I wonder, though, I go back to what I thought, I suppose, at the age of 5, and that is that the animals look quite well adapted to planet Earth. It's only us that seem to be the misfits. So probably my personal view still sits comfortably with panspermia, and then other beings coming along and doing a bit of tinkering. Maybe not just with humans, but maybe not creating everything from scratch.
Right, and we do know of, at least through the tablets found in Nineveh of these Anunnakis, they claim to have brought things like wheat and other things. And I think even they said, I could swear it said goats because of milk and stuff. But then again, that's all falls in line with what we're talking about. It's very fascinating stuff, Mr. Wallace. I figure I'll ask one more question, then we'll go to our final break if you're okay with that, sir.
Okay.
All right, because then we have some more questions, and I can't keep taking more questions in. We are, running a little long, but that's okay. This is fascinating, and this is leading up for you all to, again, click on Mr. Paul Wallace's book, all right? All right, anyway, this is from Mean Green, co-producer here. Horse trekking in the depths of the Grand Canyon. Does Paul have any info about ancient ruins in the Grand Canyon, possibly Sumerian, Egyptian finds?
Oh, that is such a fascinating topic. My attention was really drawn in that direction through listening to Graham Hancock in action, talking about America Before. And there is so much
I'm sorry,
in the way.
Get him as a guest.
So much in the way of anomalies with regard to populations on North America prior to our official histories. Now, something I learned in researching Escaping from Eden was that the most recent extinction level event, as far as we're aware, was the breakup of a massive comet impacting planet Earth around 12,800 years ago, the effects of which triggered what's known as the Younger Dryas Cold Period, which was a more intense ice age than the one we were just emerging from. We have a massive crater that's been discovered under Greenland that might relate to that moment. And what we definitely have is an extinction level event where the biggest impact was on the North American continent, obliterating the human cultures that were there at that time and extincting all the megafauna of the continent. So whatever human society was there at that time was obliterated, and we've lost a big piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, we've got more recent evidence of more recent human population in the Grand Canyon that does indeed connect North American populations with ancient Egyptian populations, and living at a height in the cliff faces that would suggest a far higher water table than is current. And then there have been paleontological finds there, human remains finds that are very anomalous indeed. Now, when I was horse trekking down the Grand Canyon, I was on the tourist trail. And so, unfortunately, I couldn't say, can we just diverge from the tourist route here and go and look at some of these other places? So I haven't been to any of them, and I was very young at the time. Obviously now, having learned a bit more and read a bit more, I would love to go back and look into that. I believe that archaeology of that kind is probably under a lot of controls. I'm not sure how welcome research in that area would be. I just have heard of a couple of researchers who've been looking into that who have been intimidated out of speaking publicly about their finds. So for those of us who haven't been there and haven't seen the things, that at the very least tells us that there's something of great importance to be discovered, looked at, and talked about.
Indeed. Now, with that being said, well, let's go to our last break, and we'll come back, and we got some more questions, and then we'll take it from there. Again, people, you know the motto. Need I say it? Pack 'em and smoke 'em. You're still definitely going to need them. This is a rockin' show. Much information. Again, click on the link for his book, Escaping from Eden, there, and pre-order that. And you'll be hearing about that book in the coming weeks. So, again, you're going to definitely want to pick that up, especially on future shows. So, again, we'll see you when we get back on the Martian Revelation.
I'll be back.
Don't run. We are your friends.
The Ruins of Mars Trilogy by Dylan James Quarles. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Set against the turbulent backdrop of the near future, The Ruins of Mars Trilogy tells the story of a long-dead Martian civilization and the team of NASA astronauts sent to explore its ghostly ruins. Far from Earth, the crew must travel on a mission more perilous than any could have anticipated. What they find buried beneath the red sands of Mars will test them to the breaking point and forever change the course of human history. Dean Marshall writes, an awesome, thrilling, intelligent, well-developed adventure. 5 stars. Carolyn Evans says, a gripping read. After 40 years of reading almost every sci-fi piece that comes my way, I love this one for its originality. 5 stars. John Mickelson says, any sci-fi reader that enjoys Mars will not be disappointed. And even if Mars isn't your thing, it's still a great read. 5 stars. According to R.W. Beaulieu, The Ruins of Mars should carry a warning label. It's that difficult to put down. 5 stars. With over 50,000 readers and hundreds of reviews, The Ruins of Mars Trilogy is a modern sci-fi classic. And now, for the first time since its publication, you can join the adventure on Audible with a brand new audiobook narrated by Stephen Cooper. Just visit Amazon.com and search The Ruins of Mars, or look for it on Audible.com by searching The Ruins of Mars. That's The Ruins of Mars by Dylan James Quarles.
Russia, pushing Okay. Tipping around, keep my brains on the floor. These are the days it never rains, but it falls. Turned away from it all like a blind man. Sat on the fence, but it don't work.
Keep coming up with love, but it's so slashed and torn.
Pressure.
Yes, indeed. Under pressure. Indeed, as we're coming down to our last half hour, and we thank Mr. Wallace for staying here for a little overtime. We are having a lot of questions, but I got to tell you, I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions. This time's very valuable, as is all of you, as I am sure, from all you listeners' standpoints around the world. And it is getting late here as well as for us. But this is very amazing. And it's a rocking show, in my opinion. Hopefully you're all enjoying it and making you think, especially after you packed them and smoked them. It lifts the hand of brainwashing from your mind. My name is Gary Legier, the Mars Revealer, known also as the Mad Martian. Of course, you're listening to the Martian Revelation. That's upon you all now. And please, everyone, go to www.paulanthonywallace.com. And make sure you click on the link to his book. Well, first click on the link. Also, save that. Check that out anytime after the show at your convenience for his YouTube channel. But definitely click on the link and pre-order that book, Escaping from Eden. And so let's get into some of these questions. So I stopped babbling. Billy on Twitter asked, Mr. Wallace, is there any information about the Anunnaki bloodline, and how does it relate to our modern-day experience?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. The stories of the Anunnaki, like many ancient narratives, speak of a ruling class over human beings, being an ET class. And then at some point, there's a pivot and they transition, they hand over to human kings and queens. And we talked about Gilgamesh as the crossover king in the Sumerian story. Saul in the Bible is the first human king in that storyline. And similar stories all around the world. When you look at the history of nobility and royalty around the world, there seems to be a very great concern with keeping the bloodlines, so that a king cannot marry a commoner. Even down to this present day, in the UK, there has to be something in the bloodline that means that royalty is not marrying someone who's a pure commoner. There has to be a connection with one of the ancient families. And so some look at that and join the dots between the beginning of the story of kingship and then how we see royalty behaving in modern history, and say that there must be a concern to preserve bloodlines for some reason. I don't have any facts that I can give you on that topic other than to say those things are an intriguing correlation. I didn't pick up anything in my probing of the text of Genesis or the Sumerian text that would really answer that question, but it's an obvious kind of question to ask once you start reading these narratives and you think about where our patterns of governance originated. But unfortunately, I don't have a trove of finds that can settle that for you.
Right. All right, that's fair enough, sir. And, no one knows everything, but you're on the well of the path to lead us all in a direction to where, again, people can contact you later and we'll find out how, and that could help you and help us all on this search. It involves us all. So human experience, right, sir?
Definitely. That's right.
Let me see. I got to jump around here. There's just so many questions coming in. Wow. Charlie on LinkedIn asked
These are great questions, by the way. These questions are amazing because the people who are sending the questions in have really thought a lot about these topics, which is really encouraging to hear.
Which means they'll be really encouraged to click that book, Escaping from Eden.
Absolutely.
Hey, does that mean we have to escape from Earth? I don't think so. We have a Space Force now. I think we're making our stand. But Charlie on LinkedIn asked if there is any information about the Emerald Tablets, and are they real?
Oh dear, that's something I'm going to have to pass on. That didn't fall under my remit, unfortunately. But I want to pick up on something that you just said, Gary, about escaping and can we escape and what does that mean? Because as I worked through the research for Escaping from Eden, I kept coming across things which suggested to me that this story about us beginning as a workforce finds a lot of echoes in human behavior. There's so much about us that gives the appearance that we have been programmed to serve superiors in some way. We manifest it in different ways, but we often live in societies where we empower elites over us, whether we live in democracies or other forms of government. We often seem to empower elites. We gaze on the 1% on 1% TV shows. We idolize movie stars, and we work for corporations and companies where our whole lives seem to revolve around we are here for people better than ourselves.
That's why I love President Trump, where he says, the elites, look at these clowns. We're the elites. God, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's okay. Well, this programming of we're all here to serve people better than ourselves is really unhelpful, and it makes us very vulnerable, whether it's to abusive employers or autocratic governments or whatever it might be. We seem to make ourselves vulnerable in that way, and I wonder if that's to do with our programming. When I came back to look at the figure of Jesus in particular and look at him in the light of this completely altered framework where my world had really changed through discovering a different story of human origins, it seemed to me that what he and his cousin John the Baptist were on about, and many of the world's great spiritual teachers, have to do with unraveling that kind of programming and empowering us to live as far healthier, happier, more autonomous human beings. And I think the escaping we have to do for ourselves in this generation has to be can we learn to live in such a way that we are not serving superiors, we're serving one another? Because if you look at the teachings of Jesus, for instance, he totally reframes the idea of what worshiping God means. And he takes it away from the idea of humans slaving for a higher entity. His idea of what worshiping God means is we love one another. We serve one another. We look after each other when we're weak and when we're sick. And that reframing continues all the way through the New Testament. And somehow or other, we miss that. And so Christianity itself often turns back into a religion of worship and obedience, worshiping somebody higher than ourselves, obeying somebody higher than ourselves. But Jesus says, you have only one master. Let's not be talking about teachers and leaders. You have only one master. He's talking about God. And you are all equals, he says. You're all brothers and sisters. And I think that's one of the great questions for us as human beings. Can we live in harmony with one another? Can we do love together? Can we do intelligence together as a society of separate individuals exercising free choice? And it seems to me that we answer that in the affirmative when we love and look after one another, not when we slave for elites, whether it's a corporation or an autocratic government.
That is very complex, and I hear what you're saying. That is very heart hitting. And you know what?
To put it in much simpler terms, I'll put it in much simpler terms. If you believe the narrative that we're created as slaves, that doesn't mean we have to be slaves now.
Ah, that's right. And he also says that, don't be a slave. That's right. You just, indeed. Matt on Twitch asked if there is any information on people living and creating a civilization under the earth.
Oh, wow. That is really very interesting indeed, because that is something that is in a number of ancient ancestral narratives. And if you go up the West African seaboard and up into the Caribbean, there is a lot of ancestral narrative about that, about a presence that lives underground, under the oceans, in fact. And then there are other narratives that you can hear from Europe about people encountering other people who have come from a population that lives underground. As I worked on Escaping from Eden, I kept having these, I call them my James Brown moments, where I'd go, wait a minute, I've heard that. I've seen that. I've heard it. I read it in a book. I've seen it in a movie. And these things I was discovering from ancient narratives keep resurfacing in books, novels, movies, TV series. Sometimes it's because someone is reading these ancient sources. Sometimes it's because they've been fed some privileged information. And sometimes I think there's another way of knowing that in storytelling, we start tapping a deeper knowledge that our race has carried. And I mention that because when I was about 7 years old, I remember watching an episode of Doctor Who. And it was way back when John Pertwee, the white-haired guy, was Doctor Who. And they had a storyline in his time of these creatures coming onto land who had been living for millennia under the oceans, and they were called the Silurians. And it was a very scary set of stories from Doctor Who that I've never forgotten. And it's only in the last year or so that I've discovered the writers of Doctor Who didn't think that story up for themselves, that they were telling an ancient narrative that's been around for probably thousands of years. I love the way writers do that for us, that they pass on stories. Sometimes they might have information they believe to be fact, but they don't have a platform to tell it as fact, and so they tell it as a story. Carl Sagan, I believe, did that with his movie Contact. And Doctor Who is doing it to this very day. There's an amazing sequence of episodes just this year with the new female Doctor Who that talked about Tesla and his discoveries, and then the government suppression of all that information. And there it is for a whole new generation to find out through watching Doctor Who. So I mention all that because, yes, there are narratives that talk about populations underground. You can find them all around the world. And sometimes those reports have survived as just a memory of contact. Sometimes they are abduction reports that unfortunately people often don't take seriously at all, which I think is very sad, because when somebody shares an abduction report, they know they're not going to advantage themselves by sharing it in any way. They're more likely to get locked up, but they do share it. And that's all the more reason we should listen with respect to these narratives. And so there are lots of places you can go to find these anecdotal evidences that, yes, there have been populations that have lived underground. We certainly discovered huge tunnel systems and large caverns that look like they sustained human life in the ancient past. Some of them, it would have been us or our ancestors surviving some planetary cataclysm, some climatic change, an asteroid impact, something like that. But there may be other cavernous regions occupied by yet others.
That's right. And listeners to this show could appreciate. I mean, we had Dr. Brooks Agnew on, and others who are also talking about that. It's funny you mentioned about the woman of Doctor Who, but let's rock here. I got a couple more questions here. Well, there's many more questions, but a couple more I'd like to bring forth to them. Fritz on vk.ru in Russia asked if there is any factual based information that will lead to the idea that the sky people actually existed, and with the ancients doing cave drawings, and many are found in France, they show animals on land but nothing in the sky. But in India, there are images of wars in the sky and dogmen on land. Can you answer by chance why the great separation of sight and knowledge? I think that's an interesting question.
That's a very interesting question. I would love to probe more into the Indian narratives and into the Vedas, because they seem to speak far more openly and straightforwardly about a time when there were beings or people on Earth who had other technologies. And they also talk about hybridized beings as well. And, you know, with some ancient narratives, you read that and you say, okay, this is an analogy, this is a metaphor for something. But from what I have heard from the Vedas, there are great tracts of literature that there's nothing in them to tell you to do that it's a metaphor. It reads like a history of things that happened and wars that took place. And yes, those portrayals are there. And I was interested in Fritz's reference to portrayals in art, because do you remember earlier we were saying that knowledge, it never really disappears. Books can be burned, priesthoods can be executed, stories can be forbidden, but very often there's a sequestration of forbidden information, and it'll go into museums and classified libraries, so on and so forth. And one of the ways in which that knowledge persists and leaks out at the edges is through art, whether it's on cave walls or rock walls, such as in Australia and in India. There are images that give every appearance that we are having a close encounter with somebody from off-planet being portrayed, and it's there for you to look at and interpret. If you go to the National Museum of Guatemala, they have a whole section devoted to ancient carved figures that appear to be wearing space helmets and Bluetooths.
Yes.
And you know, there's nothing in the official histories about it, but it's there in the canon of art, and anybody looking at those heads today knows exactly what they're looking at. You can't unsee it. It's very difficult to interpret another way.
Right, especially when we're familiar with that, to notice what that is when we're using those things today.
And somebody could say, well, look, what you're looking at is the headwear of the shaman. But that doesn't answer the question. Why does the headwear look like that? Why does the headwear look like a Bluetooth and space helmet? So you've got that, and then
he's talking to someone.
Exactly. And then there are some famous paintings in Western history that portray what look like Close Encounters with the UFOs. So there's a painting by a guy called Carlo Crivelli, painted in 1486, of the Annunciation. So that's the moment when Jesus' mum is told that she's pregnant. And in the painting, there's what looks to us like a UFO in the sky, a laser beam coming down from it into a device on her head. And when I first saw that as a teenager, I thought it had been graffitied. I thought it was a joke, a satire. And then I discovered, no, that's for real. And of course, the official story to that is, oh, well, that UFO, that's just how they portrayed angels in those days. Oh, that laser beam, well, that's just quite a common way artists would describe the impregnation of Mary supernaturally. And again, you have to say, why? Why is it portrayed that way?
Right, and a laser beam coming from what looks like a UFO, in fact. Why would that look like that?
And then there's in Belgium, there's a famous tapestry from 1538 where in the sky you've got these, well, they're either cardinals' hats or they're flying saucers. Cardinals' hats don't usually hover in the sky. Flying saucers do. And then there's another very famous picture by Ed de Gelder of the Baptism of Jesus. This is from 1710, where you've got a UFO and 4 spotlights coming down from them onto the figure of Jesus. And you can't unsee that. We look at that. We know what we're looking at. Art critics might come along and say, oh, that's just how they portrayed angels. But again, why?
Yeah.
And so I'm beginning to look at art differently, because I think that is one of the ways in which the ancient knowledge is preserved. It could be preserved through paintings, through carvings, through novels, through movies. Yeah. And the more I studied in preparation for my book, Escaping from Eden, the less I believe in fiction. I think there's so much out there that we've taken as pure fiction and not noticed that we're being told something true, that even within a made-up story, there may be aspects that are true. And when motifs keep repeating, such as in the Jungle Book, Tarzan, Planet of the Apes, Prometheus, etc., you have to stop and ask why. Why does that story have to keep being told, and why is it so resonant? Are we remembering something when we hear and tell these stories?
Yes, resonance. Indeed. If I may, sir, just 3 more questions, and thank you for your time and patience with me. All right. And hopefully you will be a recurring guest on this show. Yan, hopefully I'm saying that right. Yan on FC2 Live asked, I don't know, maybe that, I guess Korea. Yan on FC2 Live asked, has anyone really taken a look at the area of Southeast Asia, Korea, because we have many stories and numerous sightings here, and there are actually temples built in mountains and many carved in mountains. Do you believe that there were many creators and they created in various regions of the earth? I think it's a no-brainer at this point, but go ahead, sir.
Yeah, and that's a great question. By the time I'd finished Escaping from Eden, I realized I have to travel the planet. There are so many places I have to get to and see for myself. And there are cultures that have been far more open in maintaining a tradition or a knowledge of ancient contact with other beings. And it's all over the world. South America has a much more open tradition. And as I mentioned before, Asia has a much more open tradition. I haven't been to South Korea. I would love to. And often in their artistic canon, it's very open that there are other entities, other stories, what look like extraterrestrial elements. So I would love to look into that for myself, which I haven't done as yet. Now, there was a second half to his question that I've forgotten. What was the second half?
Sightings here. There are actually temples built in mountains and many carved in mountains. Do you believe that there were many creators and that they created in various...
there's many creators. Yes, I do. That is my personal belief, but I can't point to any solid evidence for it.
What do you mean? What do you mean, though, sir? Different creators, like not just Anunnaki, but other of these races or people, for the lack of a better term, different creators.
What the ancient narratives do seem to suggest is that we were engineered in stages, and it may have been different parties responsible for different stages.
Gotcha.
So that's part of the picture. And you, Gary, were asking earlier, is there any connection between how different races look around the planet, and were there parallel projects of producing the human race, sort of working in parallel way back? And I can easily imagine that, but in terms of DNA research, I haven't come across anything to actually support that idea. But I would certainly keep an eye open for that because it's so intriguing.
Excellent. And of course, hopefully be back on this show to talk about it. But Derek on Facebook asked if there are any bits of information that would show that there was a creation of a species of humanity that live under the water, since if you mine and work the earth, then under the waters would be just as easy too through genetic manipulation. What? Men with gills?
There's plenty in world mythologies to support that idea. And if we are willing to listen to people who report having been abducted, then there's a lot of contemporary anecdotal evidence to support that. There are also, of course, anomalous finds underwater. Now that we've got Google Earth, we keep seeing things underwater that we can't quite make sense of. So if we're looking for more empirical evidence, perhaps we should all be spending more time on Google Earth.
Yeah, as long as they don't, they stop, putting, obfuscating, that's a word, obfuscating certain things. All right, so I guess the last question, there's more, and I could go on, but I appreciate and they appreciate your time, sir. And we thank the listeners. And how can people keep in touch with what you're doing and share the journey and make contact, etc.? And we know already, pre-order that book, Escaping from Eden. Again, sir.
Certainly. Well, there are a number of ways. First of all, if you subscribe to the Fifth Kind TV on YouTube, you'll be seeing me in a lot of the documentaries that appear there. So that's the Fifth Kind TV on YouTube. I have my own channel, the Paul Wallace channel on YouTube. My website is paulanthonywallace.com. That's Anthony with an H, Wallace with an IS. If you go to paulanthonywallace.com, there you can find out about the book. You can pre-order it, so you can be in on the first batch. And you'll also keep up with any appearances that I'm making or new bits of research that I'm just leaking out bit by bit in anticipation of the book.
Awesome. And one more.
And Amazon. You can go directly to Amazon and pre-order it.
Exactly, which is through the link there on the facesofmars.com. And hopefully continue being here for you, for all of you, especially after the book comes out. But are you coming to the States soon? Any conferences or anything? I know a lot of the listeners, especially myself, I hope would love to meet you and, help spread the work and the word around.
Well, at this stage, I don't have any plans to be in the States, although I would have loved to have been at Contact in the Desert this year. But what I will do is, if people want to keep up with where I am, they can go to my website, and there's a page, Book Paul for an Event is the name of the page, and I'll put any itineraries up on there. So if I'm doing any appearances in the States, I'll put that up there. I'll certainly put it up on Facebook as well. And if anyone wants to send me a message, if you have research that you'd like to share with me or direct me to, then on my website, you can go to the About Paul and Contact page. There's a contact form there. Use that, and then we can get into an email correspondence.
All right. Well, I just got a question just now because of what I just asked. If you would be interested in being a guest at the Human Origins Conferences in 2021 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, this year's lineup is full, and obviously, like you said, you would need, requests and time.
That would be very interesting indeed. Yes, please do send me any information you have on that. That would be a really interesting conversation to be part of.
Oh, yes. And that's not too far from me. And yeah, that would be great. I would love to do a live interview with you there as well as others.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Oh, indeed, sir. All right. Yeah, you're definitely a fun guest, very informative. And will you be a guest on this show again?
I would love to have another conversation with you. It's been a really fun conversation, Gary. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mr. Wallace, for your time. And you rock, sir. And again, like I said, our footsteps are not our own. We're on the path, and we're making our fate to the Martian revelation. You have a good day or night, whatever it is that's coming upon you now.
Thank you. All the best.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye. So everyone, wow. I know there's many more questions. Sorry I couldn't get to them all. I know me, I yak, but we got a lot of meat on that bone, I would say. What do you people think? I mean, just think about where we're on, where we're going, and who we are. Are all you monkeys shocked? I don't know about you, but I'm wide awake. I'm ecstatic at all this. But I got to tell you, it's very compelling and thought compelling, and it does answer for many of the things that we see around the world today that was so complex, that we cannot duplicate today. But that don't mean that we weren't part of helping to create it and or labor it many years ago, to where obviously us monkeys had to be put in place. We got too cute. We weren't too cute anymore. The analogy of Babel. Isn't that interesting? Well, Mr. Wallace is definitely on the track and on the path to reveal the truth, and that's what we do and strive for each week. Everyone might not agree with it, and sometimes some things might not be of the truth, but we're in the pursuit of the truth. And I'm not asking you all to bend over, am I, to ream you, to join special clubs, special subscriptions. Yeah, I might be shooting myself in the foot. Everyone's got to make a living, right? But you know what? I'm honest, and I believe we need an honest approach. And like President Trump says, the elite. What are you kidding me? We're the elite. With that being said, till next week, the end is near.
By mistake.